Section 1. The Mystery of Bart's Gang and the Rivals Who Vanished. Let's begin in Springfield. The sun is setting somewhere behind those cracked cooling towers. The light comes in low and golden across Evergreen Terrace, washing over the trim lawns and the slightly lopsided mailboxes, settling on the yellow faces of people who have been living their quiet, impossible lives for 36 years without a single day of aging. You are not here to solve anything tonight. You are just here to listen, to let Springfield drift over you the way a familiar dream does, the kind where you know the streets and the voices but can never quite remember how the story ends. That's fine. That's exactly where we're going. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface is holding you right now, and let that weight be something welcome. You're in good hands. Springfield will take care of the rest. We're going to spend the next several hours walking through every story The Simpsons ever started and never finished. Every thread it pulled and left dangling. Every character it introduced and quietly retired to some off-screen life we never got to see. Every mystery it opened like a window and then simply didn't close. There are a lot of them, more than most people realize. Because the show ran for so long and introduced so many people and so many plot lines, that some of them got buried under the weight of 36 seasons the way old letters get buried in a drawer. They're still there. They're still real. The show just moved on and forgot to tell you the ending. Tonight we're going to find them together. So, settle in. Let the room get a little quieter around you. Let your breathing slow down to something easy and rhythmic. And let's start at the very beginning of Bart Simpson's social world, because there is a gang of children at the heart of this show that the writers gave real names and real dynamics and real potential storylines, and then abandoned so completely that most viewers have almost forgotten they ever existed. Bart Simpson's world outside his family is, when you really look at it, surprisingly rich with unfinished business. In the earliest seasons of the show, Bart had an identifiable social circle that the writers clearly intended to develop. There was Milhouse Van Houten, who remained consistent throughout the run, and whose arc with Bart is probably the most complete friendship story in the series. But around Milhouse there were others. Nelson Muntz, Martin Prince, Database. The five of them formed something that functioned almost like a defined group. And in the early years, the show seemed genuinely interested in exploring what it meant to be 10 years old in Springfield with these particular people around you. Nelson Muntz is the one who gets the closest to a fully developed arc before the show loses interest in following through on it. Nelson is introduced as a bully. That's his function. He exists to be physically threatening, to represent the danger zone that Bart navigates between his reputation as a troublemaker and his actual vulnerability as a small child in a world full of larger problems. Nelson laughs, his famous laugh, he menaces people, and the show uses him as a comedic foil. But then something starts happening in the middle seasons that the writers never fully committed to. Nelson's home life begins to leak into episodes, and what comes out is genuinely heartbreaking in the understated way The Simpsons does heartbreak best. His mother is present in early episodes. She is chaotic, unreliable, clearly struggling with addiction and instability in ways the show depicts with more frankness than you'd expect from a primetime cartoon. And then she disappears. She simply stops appearing. The show gives various explanations across different episodes, and none of them fully align with each other. She went to work at a shrimp boat. She ran off with a circus. She left and didn't come back. The explanations keep changing the way a story changes when someone is trying to avoid committing to the truth of it. Nelson's father is even more absent and even more mysterious. He appears briefly in one episode, and his reason for leaving is presented as almost aggressively absurd. He went to get cigarettes and never returned, which is the classic euphemism for a father who abandoned his family, rendered in cartoon form. The show plays it for dark laughs and moves on. What's left behind is a 10-year-old boy who is effectively raising himself, living in a house that looks like it might be structurally unsound, eating, when he eats, whatever he can find or beg or steal, going to school in clothes that don't quite fit, with a haircut that suggests no one is paying close enough attention to notice when it's gotten out of hand. The show never sits with this for very long. It introduces Nelson's situation and then drifts away from it, returning only occasionally and briefly, usually for comedic effect. There are episodes where the emotional weight of Nelson's circumstances lands with real force. He falls for Lisa. He's genuinely tender with her in ways that surprise both her and the audience. He shows in these moments that underneath the bully persona there is a kid who is starved for gentleness and doesn't know how to ask for it directly. And then the episode ends. And the next week, Nelson is back to laughing his laugh and being a background presence in Bart's storylines. And the sadness underneath his character gets folded away again. What the show never does is follow through on what Nelson's situation implies. If he's essentially unsupervised and has been for years, what does that mean for his future? The show imagines futures for most of the Springfield elementary kids in various flash-forward episodes. There are glimpses of who Lisa becomes, who Bart becomes, who Milhouse drifts toward. Nelson's future is consistently bleak in these visions, and the show presents this bleakness as a kind of dark punchline, but it never asks the harder question underneath it. He was set up to be more than a punchline. The early seasons suggested a storyline in which Bart's friendship with Nelson would be the thing that gave Nelson his first real experience of stability. The two of them have a genuine dynamic. Bart is mischievous and boundary-pushing, but he has a home, a mother who notices when he's gone, a family structure, however chaotic it gets. Nelson has none of that, and Bart's orbit is as close to belonging as Nelson ever gets. There are episodes where you can feel the show almost committing to this. Bart and Nelson at the center of something more than a one-off adventure. Bart doing something quietly decent for Nelson, not because the plot requires it, but because he actually cares. These moments exist scattered throughout the run, like breadcrumbs that never lead anywhere. The storyline that most clearly got abandoned was the possibility of Nelson being taken in, formally or informally, by another family. There are several episodes where the Simpsons' home briefly becomes a kind of refuge for him. Marge feeds him. Homer, in his bumbling way, shows him small kindnesses. The show gestures toward what it might mean for Nelson to experience something close to family, and then it gestures away again. What you're left with is a character who had the bones of one of the series' most meaningful arcs and never got to live it out. Martin Prince is the other Springfield Elementary character who deserved far more than he received. Martin exists to be the class nerd, the target, the boy whose intelligence makes him an outcast in a social environment that doesn't value what he has to offer. In this sense, he and Lisa are natural mirrors of each other, two brilliant kids surrounded by people who see their intelligence as a kind of affront. But where Lisa gets full seasons of emotional development, Martin gets recurring humiliation. The interesting thing about Martin is that the show occasionally shows you what he actually is when nobody is being mean to him. There are small moments where his genuine enthusiasm for learning is presented not as a punchline, but as something quietly wonderful. He lights up around books and experiments and ideas in a way that the show treats, in its better moments, as genuinely moving. He's not performing intelligence to impress anyone. He just loves knowing things. The storyline the show never followed was what happens when Martin finds his people. The show hints, in scattered episodes, that Martin has a rich inner life connected to interests that Springfield Elementary doesn't cater to. There are suggestions of deep friendships made at academic camps, of a world outside Springfield where someone like Martin isn't the odd one out. The show opens this door and then closes it before you can really see through it. There's also the question of Martin's relationship with his parents, which the show introduces briefly and then largely abandons. His father appears in a handful of episodes, always slightly bewildered by his son's extraordinary mind. Not cruel about it, but not quite sure what to do with it either. His mother is cheerfully oblivious. The family dynamic had real potential for something tender and complicated, the kind of storyline about a child being smarter than his environment that the show clearly cared about with Lisa but never properly extended to Martin. And then there's Database. His real name is revealed as Augustus, and he exists at Springfield Elementary as a kind of background presence in the nerd contingent. The show gives him a few spotlight moments but never commits to him as a character with a full interior life. He's there because a school episode needs a certain kind of kid, and when the episode ends, he fades back into the wallpaper. What's quietly fascinating about these abandoned kids is what they suggest about the show's vision of childhood. The early Simpsons seemed genuinely interested in mapping the social geography of being 10 years old, of understanding not just Bart's experience, but the texture of the world he moved through every day. The bullies and the nerds and the kids caught somewhere in between, the lunch table hierarchies and the playground alliances, and the constantly shifting social weather of an elementary school. The show had the architecture for something genuinely expansive in this direction. Springfield Elementary, if you'd let it, could have been its own sustained universe, a world as detailed and alive as the adult Springfield of Moe's Tavern and the nuclear plant and town hall. The writers understood this. You can see them understanding it in episodes like Bart of Darkness and Bart Sells His Soul and the Bart of War, where the show commits fully to Bart's social world and produces some of its most emotionally resonant work. But the commitment was never sustained. The show would spend a season investing in Springfield Elementary's social dynamics and then spend the next season barely visiting them. Characters like Nelson and Martin would get a moment of real depth and then spend 12 episodes in the background. The potential built up and then quietly dissipated, the way smoke does in an open room. And somewhere in there, in the gap between what the show started and what it left unfinished, there are the ghosts of 10-year-old Springfield kids who deserve to have their stories told. The last character in Bart's early social world who deserves attention before we move on is one who appears briefly, makes an enormous impression, and then disappears so completely that many fans have entirely forgotten he existed. His name is Allison Taylor. She arrives in Bart's class as a transfer student and is immediately established as Lisa's intellectual equal. She is in fact Lisa's rival in the most generous sense of that word. She challenges Lisa not by being cruel, but by being genuinely as good. A girl who can play saxophone with the same feeling Lisa does, who thinks with the same depth, who cares about the same things. The episode centered around Allison is one of the series' most emotionally honest. Lisa confronts the anxiety that comes from meeting someone who makes your exceptionalism feel less exceptional. The story handles this with real grace, and Allison herself is one of the most fully realized guest characters in the series' long history of one-appearance characters. And then she's gone. Just gone. She transfers into Springfield Elementary with enough presence to make you believe she'll be a recurring presence, a genuine companion for Lisa in the intellectual loneliness that defines her experience at that school, and then the episode ends and she's never mentioned again. The writers left Lisa isolated, perhaps because that isolation is essential to the character's emotional engine, but the way Allison was introduced felt like a promise. Like the show was saying, Lisa doesn't have to be alone. There's someone else here. And then it took that promise back without a word of explanation. These are the stories that live in the margins of Bart's world. The kids who should have grown alongside him, whose own lives should have unfolded in parallel to his, but who instead faded back into the background of Springfield Elementary and let the camera follow Bart home. They're still there, technically. They still appear in crowd scenes. Nelson still laughs. Martin still raises his hand in class. Allison presumably still attends school somewhere in that building. But their stories ended without ending. Their threads were dropped and left on the floor, and nobody ever came back to pick them up. And that, in its quiet way, is what Springfield does best. It opens a door just wide enough to make you wonder what's on the other side, and then it moves the furniture in front of it and hopes you forget it was ever there. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. Feel the edges of the room soften. The Springfield sky above Evergreen Terrace has gone from gold to purple, and the streetlights are just beginning to come on, throwing warm circles of light on pavement that has never aged a single crack since 1989. We're just getting started. End of section 1. If you're watching this late at night or first thing in the morning, drop your time and location in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribing means you'll have more of these waiting for you whenever you need them. Section 2. The lost daughter Ling Bouvier and the adoption that quietly unraveled. Stay where you are. Let the quiet settle back over you. We're moving now into a part of the Simpsons universe that most people remember, because the episode it originates from is genuinely unforgettable, but whose aftermath almost nobody has thought carefully about. It is the story of a baby who arrived in Springfield from the other side of the world, who was received with an emotion that felt absolutely real, and whose presence in the show then dwindled away so gradually that you might not have noticed when she was simply gone. Her name is Ling Bouvier. She is the adopted daughter of Patty and Selma, and the story of her adoption is one of the series' most moving one-episode arcs. But it is also one of the clearest examples of a significant life change being introduced into the show and then quietly forgotten as though it had never happened. To understand what was abandoned, you first have to understand who Patty and Selma are, and what their lives looked like before Ling. Patty and Selma Bouvier are Marge's twin sisters. They are among the show's most consistent supporting characters, reliable presences at family gatherings and holiday dinners, defined primarily by their mutual misanthropy, their chain-smoking, and their devotion to Richard Dean Anderson, the actor from MacGyver. They exist, in the show's broad emotional vocabulary, as a counterpoint to Marge's warmth. Where Marge opens up, they close down. Where Marge forgives, they hold grudges with the patience of people who have nothing better to do. They also despise Homer, consistently and without much variation, and Homer despises them in return. And this mutual disdain has provided 36 seasons of reliable comedy. It is not a complicated relationship. It does not need to be. But underneath the comedic roles, the show has occasionally suggested that Patty and Selma carry a quiet sadness that the jokes are built on top of. They are women who wanted more from their lives than what their lives gave them. They had dreams and ambitions that got swapped out for practical compromises. They ended up at the DMV, at the Department of Motor Vehicles, spending their working hours stamping forms and renewing licenses for people they find barely worth the effort of tolerating. The show has mined this for comedy, but it has also, at its best, treated it as something genuinely worth examining. The episodes that look directly at Patty and Selma's interior lives, rather than using them as comic accessories in Homer and Marge's stories, are among the show's most quietly affecting. Selma's desire to have a child runs through several seasons before the Ling storyline. She tries marriage multiple times. She marries Sideshow Bob, who turns out to be a serial criminal. She marries Troy McClure, the fated celebrity, in an arrangement that is partly contractual. She marries Lionel Hutz. She marries a man named Disco Stu. She cycles through relationships with the specific desperation of someone who knows exactly what she's missing and can't stop reaching for it. And what she's missing is a family. Not a husband necessarily, but a child. Someone to give her love to because it has nowhere to go. The show draws this need with more generosity than Selma's outer persona might suggest. Underneath the gruffness, she genuinely wants to be a mother. And the show keeps putting obstacles in front of that want, partly for comedy and partly because the character works as well as she does precisely because she keeps trying and keeps failing. The China adoption storyline is the moment the show finally lets Selma have what she's been reaching for. The episode is called Goo Goo Gai Pan. It aired in the 16th season. Selma and the Simpson family travel to China so that Selma can complete an international adoption. The episode has its comic elements, but its emotional core is earnest and warm. Selma holds Ling for the first time, and the show gives that moment exactly the weight it deserves. A woman who has wanted a child for years, finally, actually, holding one. It lands. Ling is beautiful and quiet and immediately beloved. The family returns to Springfield with this new member, and Patty and Selma are now, in a real, structural sense, mothers. The episode ends with genuine joy, and then the show doesn't know what to do with it. Ling appears in the background of subsequent episodes. She is seen at family gatherings, at holidays, in crowd shots of the Bouvier household. But she is almost never the focus. She almost never speaks. She doesn't develop as a character the way any child growing up on television should. She just exists in the margins, a reminder that something significant happened to Patty and Selma's lives, without the show doing the work of exploring what that significance actually meant. The questions the storyline raises are, when you sit with them, genuinely interesting. What does it mean for Patty and Selma to raise a child together? These are two women in their mid-40s or 50s, depending on the floating timeline. Women whose entire adult lives have been oriented around a particular kind of independence, a shared life that is closed and self-sufficient, protected by walls of cigarette smoke and cynicism. And now there is a baby inside those walls. What changes? How do the sisters negotiate the responsibilities of parenthood? What kind of mother does Selma become when she is no longer the aspirant, but the actual thing? What does Patty, who never seemed to want children with quite Selma's intensity, discover about herself when a child is placed in her care? The show gestures at these questions and then retreats from them. Ling gets the occasional spotlight moment, usually played for cuteness, but the inner lives of the women raising her are not mapped the way the premise deserves. There is also the question of Ling's own identity, which the show might have grown into in a meaningful way had it chosen to. She is a Chinese girl being raised by two white women in a mid-American town that is not particularly diverse. As she grows older, and she never really does in the show's floating timeline, but as she conceptually should grow older, The questions about her cultural identity would naturally come forward. Who she is in relation to where she came from. What Patty and Selma do with those questions. The show has demonstrated, particularly through Lisa's character, that it is capable of thoughtful, sensitive engagement with questions of identity and belonging. Lisa's struggles to belong somewhere, to find a community that receives her fully, are among the most emotionally rich material in the series. The same thematic territory, applied to Ling, had real potential. But the floating timeline works against the Ling storyline in a particularly sharp way, because babies grow. Real babies grow into real children, and real children grow into real teenagers. And all of that growth is incompatible with a show where Maggie has been 1-year-old for 3 decades. Ling can't age, so she stays a baby, or near baby, forever, and because she stays a baby, she never gets to have a story that belongs to her, rather than to the people around her. The writers seem to have recognized this problem and resolved it by simply not visiting the storyline very often. Ling is present enough that you can't say the show ignored the adoption entirely, but absent enough that the adoption never becomes what it was clearly meant to become. A transformation in the lives of 2 women who had spent the series up to that point moving through the world without ever quite landing anywhere. Patty's storyline from around the same period adds another layer to the unfinished narrative. In a later season, the show reveals that Patty is gay. The episode is handled with some care, and the comedic conceit around it is built on Patty having hidden her sexuality partly because she knew Homer would make her sexuality about him in some way, which is both funny and accurate to Homer's character. The reveal itself is presented warmly, but again, the aftermath is minimal. Patty has relationships in subsequent episodes, but the deeper questions of what her coming out means for her relationship with Marge, for the household she shares with Selma, for her role as a mother to Ling, these questions are visited briefly and then set aside. There was a version of Patty and Selma's story in which the 2 sisters became a genuine focus of the show's later seasons. 2 middle-aged women building a family together, navigating parenthood and identity, and the strange intimacy of a twin relationship that has functioned as its own closed world for so long. This version of their story would have required the show to move away from Homer and Marge as its sole emotional center, which The Simpsons has always been reluctant to do. The show's deep gravitational pull is the family at 742 Evergreen Terrace, Homer and Marge and their 3 kids. Every significant change in the surrounding cast eventually gets absorbed back into that central orbit or quietly fades from view. Patty and Selma, Ling, the adoption, the coming out, all of it was real and all of it was introduced with genuine intention, and all of it eventually drifted to the edges of the frame. Ling is still there. In the loose continuity of the show's later seasons, she's still Patty and Selma's daughter. She presumably still lives in that apartment above the DMV, or nearby, in whatever living situation the writers have implied without fully depicting. She is 12 or 13 or 14 years old by now, in the real calendar if not in the show's floating one, and we know almost nothing about who she has become. We know what she was when she arrived. We know the joy on Selma's face when she held her for the first time. We know what the show promised when it told that story. We just never got to find out what the promise was worth. The night is getting a little quieter now. Let the sound of Springfield settle around you, not the loud Springfield of disasters and explosions and Homer's ecstatic shouts, but the quieter one. The Springfield of kitchen lights left on too long and children asleep in their rooms, and adults sitting in living rooms letting the television wash over them because it's easier than being alone with their thoughts. Patty and Selma are probably in that apartment right now, somewhere behind the permanent present of the show's timeline. Ling is asleep in a room they've made for her, surrounded by things they chose for her. Selma is reading something. Patty is watching MacGyver, probably for the 1,000th time. And somewhere in that quiet apartment, there's a story that never got told. A family that formed and then retreated behind the door of a single season, leaving no forwarding address. We'll come back to the Bouvier sisters later. There's more in their world that got left unfinished. But for now, let that image sit with you. The apartment, the soft light, the baby asleep. Sometimes the most moving things about a show are the ones it didn't know it was leaving behind. Section 3. Frank Grimes and the World That Forgot Him. The light in Springfield is different at this hour. It's the kind of light that flattens details and softens edges, the kind that makes everything look like a memory of itself rather than the thing itself. The nuclear plant is a silhouette against the sky. The quick E-Mart sign buzzes somewhere in the distance, and 742 Evergreen Terrace sits exactly as it always has. Lights on, television going, Homer almost certainly doing something that would be catastrophic in any household that wasn't protected by the gravitational field of cartoon persistence. We're going to talk about Frank Grimes now, and I want you to listen carefully, because Frank Grimes is one of the most important characters The Simpsons ever created, and he's also one of the most thoroughly abandoned. What his story opened up was genuinely startling, and what happened after his episode ended tells you something profound about the kind of show The Simpsons chose to be. His episode is Homer's Enemy. It aired in the 8th season, in 1997. It is widely considered one of the series' greatest and most unsettling installments. The premise is deliberately confrontational. Frank Grimes is a man who has worked hard for everything in his life. He grew up poor, was abandoned as a child, educated himself through sheer determination, built a career through ability and perseverance, and arrived at the Springfield nuclear power plant as a qualified, competent, serious professional. And then he met Homer Simpson. Homer represents everything that Frank has been denied through his life of hard work. Homer is lazy, incompetent, has never put genuine effort into his career, and yet he owns a house, has a family, has gone to space, has been personally invited to a party by President Ford, and is universally liked by his colleagues in ways that have nothing to do with professional merit. Homer hasn't earned anything Frank cares about, and Homer has all of it. The episode follows Frank's spiral, from bewilderment to obsession to a breakdown that ends in his accidental electrocution. He dies trying to mock Homer by pretending to be Homer, touching live wires to prove that Homer's survival of such things is absurd. And he dies. He actually dies, not in a dream sequence, not in a treehouse of horror, but in a canonical episode of the main series. The episode has always been read as the show commenting on itself, on Homer's impossible, consequence-free life, on the cartoon logic that protects him from the outcomes that would befall any real human being in his situation. Frank Grimes is what reality looks like when it walks into Springfield, and Springfield kills him. Not maliciously, not even consciously. The town just continues doing what it does, and Frank can't survive contact with that. It is, in its way, a perfect episode. But what gets left behind in the rush to praise it is a question that the show opens and immediately refuses to address. Frank Grimes has a son. He appears in a later episode, and his name is Frank Grimes Jr. He is introduced as a young man who has inherited his father's grievances, who blames Homer for Frank Sr.'s death and intends to take revenge. The episode treats this as a single-episode storyline. Frank Jr. schemes and fails and departs, and Homer goes home none the wiser about the ongoing consequences of his existence on the people around him. But the introduction of Frank Jr. raises a question that the original Frank Grimes episode pointedly did not answer. If Frank Sr.'s life was the disaster that Homer's Enemy depicted, what happened to his son during that life? When Frank Sr. was growing up poor and alone, educating himself, grinding through hardship, where was this child? Was he part of that hardship? Was he being raised by someone else? How much of Frank Sr.'s driven, rigid sense of justice was shaped by the obligation he felt toward a son? The show never explains this because the show's interest in Frank Grimes ends with the punchline of Homer not remembering him at his funeral. That's the joke's cap. Homer falls asleep during the eulogy, and the episode closes on the absurdity of a world in which Frank Grimes' death barely registers. The son is introduced later as a plot mechanism, and the plot mechanism is resolved within its episode. What doesn't get resolved is what Frank Grimes Jr. actually feels about the world he lives in. He has his father's intensity, clearly. He has his father's sense that things should be fair, and are not. He has grown up in the shadow of a father who died in a way that doesn't make complete sense unless you understand the specific properties of Springfield's reality. A man who was killed by his own disbelief that the world could work the way Homer Simpson's world works. What does it do to a child, growing up with that story? What does it do to discover that your father's death was both genuinely tragic and, from a certain angle, darkly absurd? That the man who caused your father's death is the man your father spent his last weeks obsessing over, and that man went home that night and ate dinner and watched television and went to sleep without a second thought? Frank Jr.'s rage is comprehensible, and the show earns it. but it uses the rage as a plot engine and then discards the character without ever examining what that rage is built on. There was a version of a Frank Grimes Jr. storyline in which the son doesn't come to Springfield seeking revenge, but comes seeking something harder to name. Understanding? Maybe. Or confrontation with the reality that his father wasn't wrong about the world, but that his father's rightness about the world cost him everything. There's a rich vein of storytelling here about what it means to be the child of someone who was destroyed by their own principles. Frank Sr.'s principles were correct. He was right that competence should be rewarded, and that Homer's continued employment was absurd and dangerous. He was right, and being right killed him. What lesson does that teach the son? The show is interested in this question for exactly one episode and then stops being interested in it. Frank Jr. vanishes back into the off-screen world, presumably still somewhere in Springfield or its vicinity, carrying whatever he carries. And the show goes back to Homer. There's a secondary thread in the Frank Grimes storyline that deserves attention, which is the question of what his death meant for the nuclear plant. Frank Grimes was, by every measure depicted, the most qualified person working at that facility. He understood what he was doing. He took the safety regulations seriously. He was, in the show's own terms, what the plant's safety inspector should be. And he died. He died because the environment of the plant, the specific culture created by Homer's presence and Burns's management, was incompatible with someone who took the work seriously. The German investors who briefly owned the plant fired Homer immediately, which is the closest the show comes to acknowledging that Homer's employment is genuinely dangerous. Frank Grimes understood this. He understood it so completely that it broke him. What does it mean for Springfield that the one person who really understood what was happening in that reactor died in a paroxysm of frustrated disbelief? The plant continues. Homer continues. The violations continue. And Frank Grimes becomes a name that Homer doesn't remember at a funeral, a footnote in the continuing story of the most dangerous workplace in American fiction. The show never follows up on what Frank's death meant structurally for the plant's safety. His position presumably gets filled. Someone else takes over his responsibilities. And that person either becomes Homer, over time, adapting to the plant's culture of cheerful negligence, or they become the next Frank Grimes, ground down by what they find until they either leave or break. This is a story the show could tell. It would require investing in a new character with real depth and sustained commitment, which the show was less willing to do in its later seasons than in the period when Frank Grimes was created. But the story is there, embedded in the logic of what Homer's enemy established. There's also something worth sitting with about what Frank Grimes represents to the show's relationship with its own premise. The writers knew, when they wrote Homer's enemy, that they were breaking the fourth wall in an important way. They were acknowledging, through Frank, that Homer Simpson's life makes no sense. That a real person inserted into Springfield would find it not charming and absurd, but actively maddening. That the cartoon logic that protects Homer from consequences is, from a certain angle, a form of violence against anyone who operates by real-world logic. Having acknowledged this, the show could have done something interesting with that acknowledgement. It could have let it change how it told Homer's story going forward. It could have become more honest, not in a way that destroyed the comedy, but in a way that respected the audience's awareness that Homer's life is structurally wrong. Instead, the show absorbed the acknowledgement and continued. Homer's Enemy is a great episode precisely because it's a break in the show's normal logic, a moment when the writers looked directly at what they were doing and depicted what it would mean if that logic collided with reality. But the collision ended with Frank Grimes's death and the show's return to business as usual. The episode was the window. The question was whether the show would climb through it. It didn't. It wiped the glass clean and moved on. And Frank Grimes Jr. is somewhere out there, grown up now, in a Springfield that doesn't remember his father's name, breathing slowly now. The plant's cooling towers are lit up against the night sky, those two pale columns of vapor rising into the air the way they've risen every night for 36 years. From this distance, they almost look peaceful. From this distance, you could almost forget what they're doing. That's how Springfield works. Distance smooths everything over. We're going to keep going now, deeper into the stories that got left behind. Section 4. Sideshow Bob's Children and the Vendetta That Lost Its Resolution. The sound of the ocean, or something like it somewhere near Springfield Harbor. The water is dark and still, and the lights of the town are reflected in it in long, wavering lines, yellow and white and the occasional red of a traffic signal. It's a peaceful image. It almost makes you forget that somewhere in this town, or somewhere in the loose orbit of this town, there is a man with raked hair and an enormous build, and a history of attempted murders who has never quite managed to finish what he keeps starting. Sideshow Bob is one of The Simpsons' greatest recurring villains, and his story is also one of the show's most meticulously constructed unfinished narratives. Because Sideshow Bob's vendetta against Bart Simpson is the defining thread of his character, and despite decades of episodes built around that vendetta, it has never been resolved in a way that feels conclusive. It has been interrupted, it has been redirected, it has been given tentative resolutions that collapse by the next episode, but it has never been ended. Let's start with who he is, because Bob is more complicated than most of the show's villains, and the complexity is what makes his unfinished story so interesting to sit with. Robert Terwilliger, called Sideshow Bob, was the second banana on Krusty the Clown's television program. He wore enormous shoes and a raked haircut and smiled a clown's smile that barely concealed the contempt underneath. He was educated, theatrical, cultured in ways that Springfield almost entirely lacked. And he was spending his professional life being humiliated by a clown for the entertainment of children. His rage about this is entirely understandable. The show makes sure you understand it. Bob is not a monster. He is a gifted, ambitious man who made a catastrophic series of choices when his circumstances became more than he could tolerate. He framed Krusty for armed robbery. He was found out by Bart, who noticed that Krusty couldn't have committed the crime, and he was sent to prison. From that point forward, Sideshow Bob's life has been organized around two things: killing Bart Simpson and failing to do so. He has escaped from prison repeatedly, he has constructed elaborate schemes, he has gotten close enough to Bart on several occasions that the show had to work hard to find credible ways for Bart to survive. The episodes are clever and funny, and often very good. But here is what the show never fully reckons with. Bob has a family. His brother Cecil is introduced as a recurring character with his own relationship to the Terwilliger history. Cecil also has resentments, also has ambitions, also has a theatrical personality shaped by the same privileged upbringing as Bob. The dynamic between the brothers is genuinely interesting, a competition over who was more wronged by their shared circumstances, and the show explores it with genuine wit. Cecil fades from prominence relatively early. He appears, he schemes, he fails, and then the show's interest in him diminishes. He is still technically present in the show's continuity, but his role becomes increasingly decorative. The rich vein of material in the Bob-Cecil relationship, two cultured, furious brothers processing the same history in different directions, was mined for one memorable episode and then largely left alone. But it is Bob's wife and child who represent the most significant unresolved thread in his story. Bob marries a woman named Francesca in an episode set in Tuscany. She is beautiful and formidable, and the episode treats their relationship with real affection, suggesting that Bob has found someone who genuinely meets him where he is. They have a child together, a boy named Gino, who inherits Bob's enormous raked hair, and it becomes immediately clear his father's homicidal tendencies. Gino attempts to kill Bart with a knife while still a toddler, which the show plays for its specific brand of dark comedy. And then, as with so many things in Springfield, the family exists in the background of subsequent appearances without becoming the full story the show has set up. What does it mean for Bob's vendetta against Bart that he now has a wife and child? The earlier Sideshow Bob, the one driven by pure fixation, was in some ways easier to understand. He was a man with nothing left except his grievance, channeling everything into the project of revenge. But the Bob who comes home to Francesca and Gino has a life. He has something to lose. He has obligations that extend beyond his obsession. The show makes jokes about this, but it doesn't sit with the dramatic implications. Because the real question is whether having a family changes Bob's fundamental orientation. Is Gino growing up in a household where a father's defining project is killing a child? What does Francesca think of this? She's married Bob knowing what he is. She's not naive about his history. How does a marriage function when one partner's primary life goal is something that will send him back to prison and away from his family? There is a version of Sideshow Bob's story in which the family becomes the thing that finally resolves the vendetta, not through triumph but through exhaustion. Through Bob arriving at the moment where the choice is presented clearly, the obsession or the life, and having to choose. The show never quite reaches this moment. It gets close, occasionally, in episodes where Bob's relationship with Bart becomes something more complicated than pure hatred. There are episodes where Bob and Bart have achieved something close to a temporary alliance, a recognition of what the other person actually is, and these episodes are consistently among the most interesting Bob material in the series. The most famous of these is the episode where Bob, locked in a hotel room with Bart because of a hostage situation, ends up spending the evening performing the entirety of HMS Pinafore for Bart rather than killing him. It's one of the great comedic moments in the series, but it's also genuinely touching. Bob wants an audience. He has always wanted an audience. And here is Bart, who has always been his most attentive audience. The boy whose attention forced Bob out of Krusty's shadow in the first place, sitting in the dark listening to him sing. What the episode leaves unexplored is what that shared evening means. Something genuine passed between them. Something that is not quite friendship and is certainly not forgiveness, but is something. A recognition? Maybe. A mutual acknowledgement that the other person is real and complicated and deserving of more than the role they've been assigned in each other's lives. The show moves on from this without fully developing it. Bob's vendetta continues. Bart continues to escape. The dynamic resets. Gino is still out there. Francesca is still there. The family Bob built while continuing to plan murders of children is still a real thing in the show's continuity, or ought to be, though the show visits it less and less. And the central question of Sideshow Bob's arc, what it would actually take for him to stop, remains unanswered. Because the show needs him to be an ongoing threat, which means it can never let him finish. And not finishing is its own kind of tragedy, for Bob as much as for the audience. He is a great character trapped in a narrative structure that can never resolve without destroying him. And somewhere in Tuscany, or wherever the plot has deposited him this season, Gino Terwilliger is growing up with a father who is perpetually on his way to somewhere he never arrives. Let the tension of that settle into something quieter. The vendetta will keep. Springfield stories have been keeping for decades. Rest for a moment. We've got a long way still to go. Section 5. The Secret Life of Apu Nahasapima Petalon. The Quickie Mart glows. It always glows. Long after every other light in Springfield has gone off, long after Homer has fallen asleep in his chair and the Simpson kids have drifted to their rooms and Marge has turned off the kitchen light with a small, quiet click, the Quickie Mart sign is still burning. Hot dogs rotating slowly under their lamp, the squishy machine humming in the back, and behind the counter, presumably, Apu. Apu Nahasapima Petalon has been standing behind that counter for 36 years. He has a doctorate from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. He is, by every academic measure the show has established, one of the most educated people in Springfield, which is a town not particularly distinguished by its educational achievement. He holds a degree in computer science. He wrote a doctoral dissertation. He qualified for a position that would have placed him at the cutting edge of his field. And then he ended up at a Quickie Mart in Springfield, working a 140-hour week, and the show never properly explains why or what he gave up to be there. The early seasons treat Apu's academic background primarily as a punchline. He's behind the counter, he's holding a PhD, the contrast is funny. But as the show developed, and as Apu became one of its most fully realized supporting characters, the gap between what he was trained to do and what he does became something more than a joke. It became a question. What happened? The show provides fragments of an answer across scattered episodes, but they never cohere into a full story. Apu came to America for his education. He overstayed his visa at some point, and for a period of the show's continuity, he is in Springfield illegally, which adds a layer of vulnerability to his situation. He works for a corporation. The Quickie Mart is owned by a larger company headed by a CEO in India, and his relationship with that corporate structure is a source of occasional storylines. But the deeper question, what made him stay in Springfield specifically, what he was trying to build there, what the original plan was before the Quickie Mart became permanent, is never fully answered. In the episode where Apu nearly loses his citizenship, and Homer agrees to help him prepare for his citizenship test, which Homer then takes in Apu's place under a truly implausible disguise, the show touches on what America represents to Apu. There's a speech, played more seriously than the episode's comedic premise warrants, about what it means to have chosen this country and to have built a life in it, and it has genuine feeling. Apu loves Springfield. Improbably, sincerely, in the way that people love the place where their life actually happened rather than the place they planned to have their life. But the show doesn't go deep enough into what was traded for that love. The Apu, who is quietly spending his professional life behind a convenience store counter, is a man who closed some doors behind him, and the show knows this. But it treats the closing of those doors as established background rather than active story. His marriage to Manjula and the arrival of their octuplets is the other major thread in Apu's life that gets picked up and partially abandoned. The octuplets arrive with enormous fanfare. 8 babies, conceived after fertility treatments, arriving all at once into a 2-bedroom apartment above the Quickie Mart. The Springfield community responds with the particular mixture of genuine warmth and intrusive curiosity that defines its relationship to any unusual event. The Simpson family becomes central to helping manage the chaos of 8 infants, and the show seems genuinely excited about where this could go. Except where it goes is mostly nowhere. The octuplets grow, fractionally, over the seasons. They appear occasionally, a bundle of indistinguishable children, usually seen as a mass rather than as individuals. Their names are established but rarely used. Their personalities are not developed. Apu and Manjula's marriage, strained by the pressure of parenthood and complicated by other things the show introduces and then backs away from, drifts in and out of focus. The most significant storyline introduced and abandoned in Apu's marriage is his infidelity. The show depicts Apu having an affair, or something close to one, with a woman named Annette, and the storyline creates real damage in his relationship with Manjula. Manjula discovers the affair, or the approach to it, and the fallout is depicted across a couple of episodes with genuine weight. But the resolution is hasty. Apu atones, Manjula forgives, the marriage continues, and the episode closes the door on what might have been a longer reckoning with what happened between them. Because what Apu's infidelity storyline actually opens up, if you follow its logic, is a question about what his life has cost him and what that cost has done to the choices he makes. He's a man who gave up a professional path for a life in Springfield, who works hours that leave very little of him available for the family he's building, who is raising 8 children in an apartment above a store he barely finds time to leave. The pressure that would create is not the kind that vanishes in one episode of contrition and forgiveness. The show treats it that way, but reality doesn't work that way. The Apu who gets fully examined would be a study in the specific exhaustion of immigrant aspiration. He came here with a plan that the world had different ideas about, and he built something real and something genuinely his own, in the place where the plan fell apart. But the trade-offs of that rebuilding are not small. The show loves Apu enough to treat him with warmth and dignity, which is admirable, but loving a character and fully examining a character are not the same thing. His children are growing up in the background of Springfield. 8 of them. Developing personalities the show has airily sketched. Living above a store, their father is probably still working 140-hour weeks to keep running. The story of what those kids grow up to be, the second generation of a family built in a town their father never expected to stay in, is one the show has shown almost no interest in telling. Apu is still behind the counter. The sign is still glowing. And the life that runs alongside the Quickie Mart, the vast, complicated, imperfectly resolved life of a man who ended up somewhere other than where he was going, is still waiting to be fully seen. The Quickie Mart hum settles into the background. The hot dogs rotate, the Springfield night holds everything gently. We're going to let Apu have his quiet moment and move on. Section 6. Principal Skinner's hidden past beyond Armin Tamzarian. There is a man in Springfield who is not who he says he is, and everyone in Springfield knows it, and no one is allowed to say so. We touched on the Armin Tamzarian episode earlier in the context of how Springfield processes inconvenient truths. But Skinner's storyline, if you look at the full shape of it across the series, has threads of unfinished business that extend well beyond the single episode that revealed his false identity. The character's history, even before the Tamzarian revelation, was built on layers of unexamined material that the show introduced and rarely followed to their conclusions. The version of Seymour Skinner we know before the revelation is already a complicated figure. He's the principal of an elementary school in a town that doesn't particularly value education. He runs his institution with a mixture of genuine dedication and anxious rigidity, caught perpetually between wanting to do right by his students and an almost compulsive need to avoid conflict with the parents and the system above him. He's professionally competent in a way that many Springfield authority figures are not, but his competence is always being undercut by his own psychological limitations. The central limitation is his relationship with Agnes, his mother, a woman who has been the emotional anchor of his life in ways that are, on examination, genuinely alarming. Agnes Skinner is a recurring comedic figure, but her comedic function sits on top of something darker. She is domineering, dismissive, and emotionally withholding in ways that the show depicts clearly enough that it's impossible to miss what she has done to the man she raised. Skinner, well into middle age, defers to his mother on almost every significant life decision. He lives with her. He structures his social calendar around her needs. He has spent his adult years in an emotional position more appropriate to a child than to a man with professional authority and a developed inner life. The show explores this dynamic most fully in its examination of Skinner's romantic life, particularly his long, unresolved relationship with Edna Krabappel. The two of them circle each other for years in a way that is both genuinely funny and genuinely sad. Two adults who clearly have feeling for each other, who understand each other's specific loneliness in ways that the other people in their lives cannot, who keep finding their way back to a doorstep and then retreating before they can fully walk through it. Agnes is part of why. The show makes clear, in scattered moments, that Agnes's hostility to any woman who gets close to Seymour is a significant obstacle to his building a life outside her orbit. She doesn't want to lose her son to someone else's life. She may not be conscious of this exactly, but the pattern is unmistakable. Skinner can never quite close the distance between himself and a relationship because Agnes is always there to make the distance feel safe. The Skinner-Edna relationship deserved a resolution. For years, the show seemed to be building toward one, in the slow way that long-running shows sometimes build toward things, through accumulation of glances and conversations and near misses that suggest something is being saved up for the right moment. The right moment didn't come in the way the story was pointing. Edna was eventually retired from the show not through a storyline conclusion, but through the real-world death of the actress who voiced her, Marcia Wallace, who passed away in 2013. The show honored her memory gracefully, and Edna's departure from Springfield was handled with genuine feeling, but it meant that whatever the Skinner-Edna story was building toward was cut short not by narrative choice but by circumstance. The door was not closed by the writers. It was closed by loss, and what remained after it closed was a Seymour Skinner whose romantic life simply stopped, who remained in his mother's house, in his mother's orbit, without the counterweight that Edna had provided, even imperfectly. Now add the Tamzarian layer back in. After the revelation that Skinner is Armin Tamzarian, and after the town votes to restore the fiction and exile the truth, what does Skinner's psychology actually look like? He is a man who built an identity on a theft. He took someone else's name, someone else's history, someone else's mother, and then he spent decades performing that identity so completely that it became genuinely his. He is Seymour Skinner in every way that matters emotionally and practically, even if the legal truth is Armin Tamzarian. But he knows. He has always known. And the weight of that knowledge, the specific burden of having built your entire life on a borrowed foundation, is not something that goes away because a judge issues a decree that the lie is now the truth. The psychological reality of Skinner's situation is rich territory that the show visits occasionally, in small, dark jokes about his military service in Vietnam, or his complicated relationship with Bart, or his vague, never quite specified yearning for a life that doesn't look like the one he has. But it never commits to a sustained examination. What would Skinner be, the show never quite asks, if he had been Armin Tamzarian from the start? What would Tamzarian have become if he hadn't stumbled into a borrowed identity that gave him structure and purpose? Is the man he is now, the dedicated if neurotic principal, something the real Seymour Skinner would have been? Or is the borrowed identity genuinely an improvement on what Tamzarian would have built on his own? These are genuinely interesting questions. The show has built a character capable of carrying them, and then it has declined to follow through on them, returning Skinner to his function as principal and comedic obstacle, restored to the fiction, protected by the legal decree that makes the lie official. There is one more thread in Skinner's history that deserves attention before we move on: his Vietnam service. The show establishes that Skinner was a POW, that his capture and the uncertainty around his fate is what allowed Tamzarian to slide into his identity. His wartime experiences are occasionally referenced, usually for dark comedy or for brief emotional beats, but they're never examined fully. What did Vietnam do to Seymour Skinner? What did years of captivity do to the man who eventually came back to find his life had been given to someone else? The episode where the real Skinner returns is rushed, and his departure from Springfield is resolved quickly. We barely have time to understand who he is as a person before he's tied to a railroad car and removed. He arrived carrying decades of history, and the show gave him maybe 15 minutes before deciding it didn't need him to be complicated. He's still out there, somewhere. The real Seymour Skinner, the decorated veteran, the man whose identity was stolen, living whatever life came after Springfield decided it didn't want him back. And the man who took his name is still in his office, still managing Agnes, still presiding over a school where Bart Simpson continues to find new ways to make his life difficult. The story of who Armin Tamzarian really is was opened and never finished. The show sealed the fiction back in place and declared the question resolved. But sealed fictions have their own kind of weight. They sit in the middle of a person's life, heavy and unchanging, even when no one is allowed to speak their name. Breathe in, breathe out. Let Springfield's late-night quiet do its work. We're going deeper. Section 7. The Stonecutters and the Secret Society that owned Springfield. Somewhere under Springfield, or in a building Springfield pretends is for something else, there is a room where the men who actually run this town gather in purple robes and number-based hierarchy and discuss the business of running everything from behind a door that doesn't officially exist. This is the Stonecutters, and the episode that introduces them is, depending on who you ask, either one of the show's funniest or one of its most quietly disturbing, and the answer is probably both. The episode is called Homer the Great. It aired in the 6th season. Homer discovers that the Stonecutters, a secret society to which both Lenny and Carl belong, are behind essentially every major institution in Springfield and possibly in America. They control the media, the government, the educational system. They decide who wins the Academy Awards. They keep the metric system from being adopted. They have a sacred scroll that has governed their order for centuries, and when Homer inadvertently destroys the scroll, he's about to be expelled before a birthmark on his rear reveals that he is the chosen one of Stonecutter prophecy. Homer becomes the Stonecutters' supreme leader. He uses his new power to demand free beer and back rubs. The Stonecutters, exhausted by his leadership, dissolve their organization and form a new one that excludes Homer. The episode ends with Homer alone, no longer the chosen one of anything, back to being the unremarkable employee at the nuclear plant that he was before any of this happened. And the Stonecutters, reformed as the No Homers Club, continue their operations under a new name. This is played primarily as comedy, and it works as comedy. But what the episode establishes, and what the show then never revisits in any meaningful way, is that Springfield is run by a secret society. That the institutions Homer and his neighbors move through every day, the government, the schools, the media, are not operating on any publicly understood principles, but are managed by a private organization for the benefit of its members. This is played as a joke, but it's also a premise with enormous dramatic potential that the show established and then completely abandoned. Who are the Stonecutters, or the No Homers Club, in the years after Homer's failed leadership? They're still there, presumably. Lenny and Carl are still members. Their membership suggests that the social fabric of the plant, the daily environment Homer moves through, is partially organized around a network he can no longer access. The friendships he thought were simple, friendships are embedded in an institutional structure with rules and hierarchies he's been excluded from. What does it do to Homer's relationships with Lenny and Carl, the two people at the plant he's closest to, that they belong to something Homer doesn't belong to? The show occasionally gestures at the Lenny and Carl relationship's surprising depth, at the suggestion that these two men share something more than their roles as Homer's workplace companions. But it doesn't connect this to the Stonecutter framework in any sustained way. There's also the larger question of what the Stonecutters' existence means for Springfield as a political entity. If there is a secret organization controlling municipal outcomes, then everything that happens in Springfield is happening within a framework most of Springfield's residents can't see. The elections, the zoning decisions, the allocation of municipal funds, all of it is downstream of decisions made in that purple-robed room. This connects naturally to the Burns storyline because Burns is clearly a stonecutter. He is precisely the kind of powerful, established Springfield figure who would be central to that organization. The show hints at this without fully committing to the implications. But if Burns and the stonecutters are aligned, then the power structure of Springfield is even more concentrated than it appears on the surface. One man and one organization, working in concert, controlling everything from the power supply to the cultural institutions. And Homer almost had access to all of that, briefly, by accident of a birthmark, and then lost it because he couldn't resist the opportunity to make people give him things. The show finds this funny, and it is funny, but it's also a premise that the writers built and then walked away from, leaving the secret society intact and the power structure unchanged, with Homer back outside the door and no particular awareness of what he briefly had his hand on. Springfield is still being run by a club, the club is still meeting, and Homer is still in Sector 7G, thinking the world works the way it looks like it works. He's wrong. He's been wrong his whole life. The Stonecutter's torch burns somewhere in a room nobody official acknowledges. The next item on their agenda was tabled 30 seasons ago, and it's still there, waiting. Section 8. Homer's half-brother Herb Powell and the family that almost was. There is a story about family that The Simpsons told twice, and then stopped telling. It is one of the show's most emotionally naked storylines, built around a character who appeared in only 2 episodes and carried enough weight for a full season arc, and whose absence from the show, after his second appearance, is one of the more striking gaps in 36 years of storytelling. His name is Herbert Powell. He is Homer's half-brother. And the story of what happened between them, and what it meant, and what it left undone, is one of the quiet tragedies hidden in the middle seasons of the show. The backstory is revealed in the first Herb episode. Homer's father, Abe, before his marriage to Homer's mother, Mona, had a relationship with a woman at a carnival. That relationship produced a child. The child was given up for adoption and grew up to become, through ambition and ability and a particular kind of driven American success, Herbert Powell, the CEO of Powell Motors, one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the country. Herb, at the start of his first episode, has everything. He's wealthy, he's successful, he's reached the summit of what American achievement looks like on the surface. But he has no family. He grew up adopted, and the adoption was not a warm experience. And the absence of the biological family he was separated from is a void that his success has not filled. He finds Homer. And in Homer, he finds something that he didn't expect to find, which is genuine, uncomplicated acceptance. Homer doesn't care about Herb's money or his status. Homer is just happy to have a brother. The warmth between them is immediate and real, and the episode earns it because both characters are shown wanting the same thing, connection, in the specific way that people want things they were taught to doubt they deserved. Herb brings Homer to Detroit to design a new car for Powell Motors. Homer's car is, to put it gently, an atrocity. It is designed entirely according to Homer's own preferences and limitations, which are extensive and specific and have no relationship to the preferences of any consumer alive. The car is hideous, overpriced, and a commercial catastrophe. Powell Motors goes bankrupt. Herb loses everything. And Herb, in the moment of his greatest loss, blames Homer. Tells him he never wants to see him again. The family that had just formed shatters in the same episode that created it. The second Herb episode, in a later season, brings him back to Springfield. He has rebuilt himself, slowly, with nothing. He arrives at Homer's door essentially destitute, and the episode follows his attempt to recover financially through an invention he's built, a device that translates baby speech into words adults can understand. Maggie is his test subject. The invention works. Herb makes his fortune back. He forgives Homer, and then he leaves. And the show never brings him back. The forgiveness at the end of Herb's second episode is emotionally satisfying in the way that television resolutions often are. The arc is completed, the damage is repaired, the relationship is restored. But it's also, when you look at it carefully, a conclusion that doesn't fully account for everything that was opened in the first episode. Herb found his biological family. He found a brother, a sister-in-law, 3 nieces and nephews. He found the connection that the void in his life had been shaped around. And then, having found it, he left Springfield and never came back. Why? The show's implicit answer is that he has his own life to return to, that the Powell Motors story was his Springfield chapter and it's closed. But the emotional logic of what the character went through suggests something more complicated. He wanted family. He found family. He was hurt by family. He forgave family. And then he went somewhere else. What does family mean to Herb after all of that? He went looking for it his whole life and found it in a form that immediately devastated him and then slowly repaired itself. Is that enough? Did he take the experience and integrate it into a life that now includes a brother, periodic visits, birthdays remembered? Or did he take his repaired fortune and his repaired relationship and move them both to a comfortable distance where neither one could hurt him again? The show leaves this completely unaddressed. Herb appears in later seasons in background shots occasionally or is mentioned in passing. But his actual relationship with Homer and the Simpson family in the years after the reconciliation is never depicted. There's also the question of Abe Simpson in all of this. Abe's extramarital child, the product of a relationship he had before his marriage to Mona, is the origin of Herb's story. Abe knows Herb exists. He has been carrying the knowledge of this other child for decades. The show gives him a moment with Herb, briefly, but it doesn't fully explore what Herb's existence means to Abe, who has spent his own life shaped by omission and silence and the particular sadness of a man who feels he has nothing left to offer anyone. Herb, if you think about it, has something profound in common with Mona. Both of them are people whose connection to Homer was ruptured by circumstances and repaired imperfectly and then moved to the edges of the story. Both of them represent chapters of Homer's family history that were opened, examined with genuine feeling, and then allowed to close. Homer has a half-brother, a wealthy, capable, successful half-brother who forgave him for ruining his life. Who found in Homer the family connection he'd spent his whole life missing? And Homer almost certainly hasn't called him in years. That's not a criticism of Homer's character, that's just Homer. Homer lives in the moment, intensely and completely, and the moments that aren't happening right now have a tendency to drift away. He doesn't call Herb because calling Herb is not the thing that is in front of him right now. But somewhere in Detroit, or wherever Powell Motors has reestablished itself, Herb is building something. Still the only half-brother Homer Simpson has in the world, still the holder of a connection that Homer seems to take less seriously than Herb does. The family they almost had is still available. Nobody formally ended it. It's just been waiting, patiently, in a city Homer is not currently thinking about. Let that rest in you for a moment. The quietness of a relationship that never quite resolved. The distance between two half-brothers who could close it and probably won't. Springfield is full of those distances. They are part of what makes it feel like home. Section 9. Maud Flanders, the death that changed nothing and everything. There is a grave in the Springfield Cemetery. It belongs to Maud Flanders, who died in the episode called Alone Again, Natura Diddley, which aired in the year 2000. She was struck by a t-shirt launched from a cannon at the Springfield Speedway, and the shot that hit her was redirected because Homer moved out of the way. Homer's reflexes killed Ned Flanders' wife. We discussed Ned in the framework of the theories, but Maud's death deserves its own examination because of what the show did and did not do with its aftermath. Because Maud's death was the most significant thing to happen to a major supporting character in the show's history up to that point. It was real, canonical, permanent. And the way the show processed it, or failed to process it, tells you a great deal about what The Simpsons was willing to commit to. In the immediate aftermath, the show gave Ned's grief genuine screen time. He processes his loss in ways that feel real. The disorientation, the attempts to return to normality that keep failing because normality no longer exists in the shape he's used to. He tries to begin dating again, at the urging of his neighbors, and the dates are disasters of different kinds, some funny and some genuinely sad. He hasn't lost his faith, but his faith is being tested by the specific cruelty of how Maud died. A t-shirt cannon, a freak redirection, no grand meaning to attach to it. The show does something interesting in the episode that reveals the mechanism of Maud's death, which is that it doesn't exonerate Homer and it doesn't condemn him either. He moved out of the way of flying t-shirts because he wanted the t-shirts. That's who Homer is. He did nothing malicious. He did something entirely in character. And a woman died. This is the most honest the show ever gets about the relationship between Homer's choices and their consequences for the people around him. It usually protects him from consequences. Here, it allowed the consequence to be permanent. But then, Over time, Maud's presence fades. Her name is mentioned less frequently. The specificity of Ned's grief softens into a background characteristic. He is the widower. He is the man whose wife died. This becomes part of his identity without continuing to drive his storylines. The most significant unresolved thread in Maud's absence is the impact on her sons, Rod and Todd. Rod and Todd Flanders are young boys who were raised in a household defined by religious devotion and parental warmth. Maud and Ned together created a specific kind of childhood for their sons, sheltered and genuinely loving, with the particular anxieties that come from a very strict religious upbringing but also with real stability underneath. They were cared for. They were known. And then their mother died. And their father, though he tried, was clearly struggling in ways that the show captures in its better moments. A single father with two young boys in an unfamiliar shape of life, trying to maintain the warmth of what they'd had while processing a loss he doesn't have a map for. The show touches on how Rod and Todd are coping, occasionally, but it doesn't examine the experience of childhood grief with any sustained attention. They appear in their father's episodes as supporting characters in his story rather than as subjects of their own. Their inner lives around their mother's absence are presumed rather than depicted. There's a particular storyline that deserved more attention. What happens to Rod and Todd's faith when their mother dies? They have been raised in a household where faith was central and constant and lived in, and then the world took their mother in a way that offers no satisfying theological explanation. You can believe in God's plan and still be, at 7 years old, inconsolably confused about why God's plan involved your mother being hit by a projectile at a sporting event. The show gestures at this question without fully committing to it. Religion and faith in Springfield are generally treated as sources of comedy, with Ned's fervor being the primary comedic target. But the Rod and Todd material, when the show lets itself be serious about it, has real potential for something more nuanced than comedy. Ned eventually does find a relationship with a woman named Edna Krabappel, who of course is also Bart's teacher, and who has her own history and her own complicated relationship to the Flanders family as a concept. The Ned-Edna relationship is treated warmly, and it's one of the show's more genuinely hopeful romantic storylines in its middle period. Two people who have been lonely finding each other, surprising themselves with how much they want the same things. But then, as discussed earlier, Edna dies. Not in the show's narrative, but in the real world, because Marcia Wallace passed away, and the show honored her by letting Edna go. So Ned loses two women. And the shape of his life after the second loss is never properly examined. He returns to being the single father next door, the devout neighbor, the man with whom Homer has a relationship of affectionate friction that never quite resolves into the deeper friendship it sometimes gestures toward. Maud's grave sits in the cemetery. Rod and Todd have grown up, or been prevented from growing up by the floating timeline, into young men whose experience of loss was significant and whose emotional lives the show never mapped fully. The death was real. The reckoning was incomplete. That is, in its own way, the most human thing about it. The cemetery is quiet at this hour. The Springfield sky sits above it, wide and dark, and the graves are all there, side by side, permanent in a town where almost nothing else is. Maud Flanders is still remembered, even if the show stopped saying her name. Section 10. Lisa's Love Stories and the People Who Disappeared. Lisa Simpson has been in love more times than any other child character in the history of American animated television. Not in a comic relief way, not as a running joke about a precocious 8-year-old, but in the full, aching way that Lisa does everything, completely, without reservation, with a heart that is constitutionally incapable of half measures. And every single person she has loved has left. The pattern is so consistent that it almost seems intentional, though whether it's the result of deliberate thematic design or simply the consequence of an episodic storytelling format that can't sustain ongoing relationships, the effect on the character is the same. Lisa is 8 years old, and she has already learned, in the deep body way that children learn things from their most formative experiences, that love is temporary, that the people you love will eventually be separated from you by circumstances you can't control. Let's go through them, because they deserve to be named, and their disappearances deserve to be acknowledged. Langdon Alger is the first. He is Lisa's substitute teacher, voiced in the original episode with a warm, open quality that makes him feel genuinely exceptional. He is kind to Lisa in the specific way that exceptional teachers are kind, which is to say that he treats her intelligence as a gift rather than a challenge, engages with her on her own terms, makes her feel seen in a world that usually responds to her with bewilderment or dismissal. Lisa falls for him with the totality that she brings to everything. And the episode explores this with remarkable honesty, acknowledging the asymmetry of what's happening, a student's infatuation with a teacher, while also treating the emotional experience as real and valid. Her feelings are not mocked. Her devastation when he leaves Springfield is given real screen time. He leaves because he is a substitute teacher, which means by definition he is passing through. He gets a job in another city and he goes there. The ending is not cruel. It is just the way things are. And the episode's emotional intelligence is in not pretending there's a painless way to receive that. But there's a thread in the Langdon episode that the show never follows up on, which is the question of what Lisa does with the experience after the immediate grief passes. Because what she learned from Langdon, not the infatuation, but the actual experience of being truly seen by a thoughtful adult, is something that should have a lasting effect on who she is. She was shown what it feels like to be met fully. She had a model of the kind of intellectual engagement she is capable of but rarely finds in Springfield. Does that experience make her lonelier? Does it make her more determined to find her way to places where people like Langdon are more common? Does it become part of the private map she's building of who she wants to eventually become? The show moves on from Langdon without examining what he left behind in her. Nelson Muntz is the next significant relationship, and it is handled with genuine courage by the show because it takes a character who functions primarily as a bully and asks you to believe that there is something real between him and the smartest, most principled girl in Springfield. And it works. It works because the show commits to the sincerity of it. Nelson, in his relationship with Lisa, is shown to be something other than a bully. He's a kid who is starved for connection, who has never had the kind of person in his life that Lisa is, someone who sees him as a full human being rather than as a threat or a disappointment. And Lisa, for her part, sees something in Nelson that most of Springfield misses, the real person underneath the persona. Their relationship ends, as it probably had to end given the social pressure it generates, but the ending is genuinely sad. They're not a good match in practical terms. Their lives are moving in different directions, and those directions don't run parallel. But the connection was real, and both of them feel its loss. What the show doesn't follow is how that relationship changes Nelson afterward. The softer version of Nelson that emerged during his time with Lisa, the version capable of tenderness and vulnerability, does that person persist? Does he find other ways to access that part of himself? Or does he rebuild his walls when the relationship ends and go back to being the bully because the bully is safer? The show visits Nelson regularly in subsequent episodes, and he is, for the most part, the bully. The Nelson who held Lisa's hand is somewhere in there, presumably, but the show doesn't check on him. Then there is Bleeding Gums Murphy. Bleeding Gums is not a romantic love. He is the musician who gives Lisa a model for what she can be. He is the man who teaches her, through his own example, that a life organized around music and feeling is a life worth living. He takes her seriously as a musician and as a person. He is, in the fullest sense, a mentor, and he dies. His death is one of the series' most genuinely moving moments, handled with real tenderness, and the episode that depicts it is rightfully considered one of the show's masterpieces. But his death is also the show's first major instance of giving Lisa someone essential and then taking that person away. It establishes a pattern that will define her emotional life throughout the series. After Bleeding Gums, there is Colin, the environmentally minded boy from the Simpsons movie, who is introduced as a potential love interest, treated as significant within the context of the film, and then essentially absent from the television show thereafter. He exists in the continuity of the film without being incorporated into the ongoing continuity of the series, which leaves him in an odd liminal space, real within one medium, absent from another. There is a pattern here that, when you look at it as a single arc rather than as individual episodes, tells a story about Lisa that is both beautiful and sad. She loves fully and is separated consistently. She learns over and over that the people who see her most clearly will eventually be somewhere else. The show intends this to reflect the particular loneliness of being exceptional in a limited environment. Lisa will eventually leave Springfield. All the flash-forward episodes suggest this. Her future is elsewhere, in a place where her abilities will be received rather than resisted. And the people she loses along the way are the shape of that departure, arriving early, leaving early, preparing her for the bigger leaving she hasn't made yet. But the preparation is never named. The pattern is never acknowledged within the show's own narrative. Lisa moves from loss to loss without the story ever giving her the chance to look at the pattern and understand what it's showing her. She is 8 years old, and she has already loved and lost in ways that most adults don't experience until much later. The show knows this, and it is moved by it, and it depicts it with care. But it doesn't give Lisa the chance to fully know it herself. She plays her saxophone. She sits at her window. The Springfield night is wide, and she can see the distant suggestion of somewhere else, if she looks at the right angle, at the right hour. She is waiting to grow up in a town that won't let her. That's the whole of it, in one image. Let your breathing slow down. Let the night deepen. We have many more stories to find together, and there is no hurry. Section 11. The Burns Files storylines the billionaire never finished. There is a moment in every Charles Montgomery Burns episode where you see the scale of what's unresolved. He turns from his window. He opens a folder. He begins a sentence that contains a reference to something that happened in 1923, or 1947, or 1908. The years sliding by with the casual intimacy of personal history rather than the studied distance of historical knowledge. He speaks about the 20th century the way most people speak about their childhood. He is, by any reasonable estimate, 130 years old, and he has been doing things for most of those years, many of which the show has introduced and none of which it has concluded. Burns is the show's most inexhaustible source of unfinished business. This is partly because of his age, which means he has more past than any other character to leave unresolved. And partly because his power means that the things he initiates are large enough to have long shadows. Let's start with the $1 trillion bill. This is one of the show's most extraordinary pieces of backstory. During World War II, the United States government created a single $1 trillion bill to aid in the post-war reconstruction of Europe. The bill was entrusted to Burns for the journey. Burns pocketed it. He has been carrying around a piece of currency worth $1 trillion since the 1940s. The episode built around this bill is funny and action-oriented and involves international intrigue and Fidel Castro, as episodes involving Burns often do when the show reaches for his historical breadth. But the episode ends with Burns losing the bill, and the fate of the $1 trillion bill after that is left open in a way that should bother you more than it does. A $1 trillion bill exists in the Springfield universe. It was created by the American government. It was stolen by Burns. It has been floating through the show's continuity for decades. Where is it? Who has it now? Has anyone ever attempted to redeem it? Does it still have legal status as currency, or has the government that issued it written it off as lost? The show never says. The bill disappears into the same drawer where the show puts things it's finished joking about but hasn't properly resolved. There is also the matter of Burns's personal history with Smithers, which the show has been circling for decades without fully committing to a frank examination. Smithers's devotion to Burns is one of the longest-running, most clearly depicted, most consistently avoided topics in the show's history. The show has always made it absolutely transparent that Smithers's feelings for Burns are romantic. This is not a reading that requires much interpretive effort. It is baked into the show's presentation of him in hundreds of episodes. He is devoted to Burns in a way that goes far beyond professional loyalty, in a way that has clearly organized his entire life around a single person, and the question of what Burns actually knows or thinks about this is something the show has danced around for 30 years. There is an episode that directly addresses Smithers's feelings, in which he finally confesses them to Burns, and Burns responds with a kind of benign incomprehension. The resolution is played lightly, and the show moves on without examining what that response does to Smithers. A man confesses the defining emotional fact of his life to the person that fact is organized around and receives a response that suggests the person simply did not register what was said. What does Smithers do with that? What does it mean for a man who has structured decades of his life around this person to receive not rejection, but incomprehension? Is incomprehension worse? Is it more isolating? The show is too kind to Smithers to ignore this completely, and there are episodes where his loneliness and the narrowness of his emotional life are treated with real sympathy. He deserves a resolution. He deserves, at minimum, an honest acknowledgement that the way he has organized his life is costing him something. The show has never given him that. It keeps him devoted, keeps him beside Burns, and visits his unhappiness occasionally, without committing to an honest reckoning with what his life actually looks like from the inside. Burns also has a son. An episode reveals this: a young man named Larry, who is Burns's biological child, and whose existence upends Burns's established characterization for exactly one episode before the show, more or less sets Larry aside. The idea that Burns, who has never seemed to want anything from another person except compliance and occasional companionship, has a child is rich with dramatic potential. What is Burns to his son? What is his son to Burns? A man who has spent more than a century being essentially alone in a way that money and power can't fix. The Larry episode is genuinely moving in its better moments, because it shows Burns reaching towards something warm and then not quite being able to close the distance. He wants to be a father and he doesn't know how to be a father, and the comedy of that collision has real feeling underneath it. Larry is also a character with his own perspective on what it means to be the son of a man like Burns, to have grown up without a father of this particular kind. But the episode ends, and Larry recedes. He is, in the show's continuity, still Burns' son. That fact exists. It just doesn't do anything. There are other Burns storylines that were opened and left alone. His rivalry with various historical figures, his involvement in events that the show has placed him at the center of without fully explaining what he was doing there, his relationship to the broader history of American industry and power, the way his wealth shaped Springfield's political life in ways that occasionally become explicit and then get buried again. Burns is, at his most examined, a study in what unchecked power looks like over a very long time. He has survived everything because he built a system designed to ensure his survival. But that system has costs, for Springfield and for Burns himself, that the show acknowledges in fragments and never fully totals. The sum of Burns's unresolved storylines is, if you add it up, the story of a man who has everything except the things that money can't hold. He has immortality of a sort, he has security, he has control, he has Smithers's devotion, the value of which he has never fully reckoned with. What he doesn't have is any meaningful relationship. Not with Smithers, not with Larry, not with anyone in Springfield who treats him as a person rather than as a force of nature. He has always been the most isolated person in town, and the show has always known this, and it has used that isolation for decades as comedy and tragedy and everything in between. But it has never arrived at the thing that would complete that arc. The moment where Burns's isolation costs him something he can't buy back. The moment where the system he built fails in the way that human systems eventually do, not with catastrophe but with quiet revelation. Burns's window overlooks Springfield from the top floor of the plant. He has watched this town for 100 years. He knows more about it than anyone alive. And he has never, in 36 seasons, told anyone what he's seen. That silence is the biggest unresolved storyline he carries. And it's the one the show can never touch, because touching it would mean ending him. Section 12. Springfield's loose ends: Krusty, Barney, and the town's unresolved souls. The town is quieter now. You can hear things you can't hear during the day: the settling of the quick E-Mart structure, the hum of the plant's external equipment, the distant sound of Moe's tavern jukebox playing something slow and slightly mournful. We're going to spend some time now in the broader geography of Springfield's unresolved lives, moving through the supporting cast and finding the threads that were pulled and left hanging. Because Springfield is not just the Simpsons and Burns and Skinner. It is a town, and towns are full of people, and people have stories, and not all of those stories get finished. Krusty the Clown begins. Krusty's real name is Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustofsky. He is a Jewish comedian who became a clown. His father, Rabbi Krustofsky, disowned him for choosing a career in entertainment rather than the rabbinical path, and the estrangement between father and son was one of the show's most emotionally effective storylines in its early seasons. Bart helped reconcile Krusty with his father in a memorable episode, using Sammy Davis Jr. to deliver a citation from the Talmud that opened the door to forgiveness. The reconciliation was genuine, the relationship was restored, and then Rabbi Krustofsky died. Not in a major episode, but in a small, almost incidental mention. He passed away, and Krusty was bereaved, and the show moved on. What the show never did was examine what the reconciliation and subsequent loss actually meant to Krusty's sense of himself. He spent years estranged from his father. He made peace with his father. He lost his father not long after. The arc of that relationship, compressed into a few episodes over several seasons, is genuinely moving when you trace its outline. But Krusty is also a man with an enormous amount of unresolved material outside his relationship with his father. He has a daughter. She appears in a later season, a girl named Sophie, who is the result of a brief relationship during the Gulf War. Her mother is a soldier, and Sophie was raised in circumstances that Krusty wasn't part of. And the episode that introduces her is about Krusty becoming a father retroactively, learning what it means to have someone who needs him in a new way. Sophie appears in a handful of episodes and then drifts to the background. Her relationship with her father, the process of him learning to be present for someone rather than performing for them, which is the fundamental challenge of Krusty's entire character, is a thread that the show picked up and set down. Krusty is a man who has spent his life performing. His comedy is not a calling for him the way Bleeding Gums' music was a calling. It is a trade, a survival mechanism, a way of being seen by people without ever letting them see anything real. Behind the grease paint is a person who is deeply unhappy, who is addicted and self-destructive, who has burned through relationships and opportunities with the specific efficiency of someone determined not to let anything good get too close. The show uses Krusty's unhappiness as a source of dark comedy and occasional pathos, but it never arrives at the question his character is building toward. What would Krusty do if he stopped performing? If he allowed himself to be Herschel in a room with someone who actually wanted to know him? Sophie was a path toward that answer. She was someone who wanted her father, not the clown, not the celebrity, but the actual person underneath. And the show opened that door and then didn't walk through it. Krusty is still on the air, still doing the show. The studio lights are still on, and the laugh track is still going, and somewhere in there, under all of it, Herschel Kristofsky is still waiting for something he's never been able to name. Barney Gumble is next, and his storyline is one of the most poignant abandoned arcs in the show's history. Barney has been Homer's best friend since childhood. He is present in virtually every episode set at Moe's Tavern, a fixture of the bar's particular ecosystem, a man whose presence is so expected that his absence would be notable, but whose presence has become almost invisible through familiarity. The show slowly builds Barney's alcoholism from a background detail into an acknowledged fact of his character. He is not just a man who drinks. He is a man whose drinking has consumed him, whose entire life has been organized around access to alcohol, who has lost everything that his pre-drinking self might have been or done or had. There are glimpses of the Barney who existed before the drinking took hold. It emerges over the course of various episodes, genuinely intelligent. He has abilities the alcohol has buried. In one extraordinary episode, he makes a film of real emotional depth and cinematic intelligence that shocks everyone who sees it because nobody in Springfield knew this was inside him. And in another episode, Barney gets sober. This is the breakthrough the show had been building toward. Barney, after years of being the bar's anchor, decides to get help, goes through the process of getting sober, and emerges on the other side as someone different. Someone the show seems genuinely interested in exploring. Who is Barney without the drinking? What is he capable of? What does his intelligence look like when it's not being suppressed by alcohol? What kind of relationship can he have with Homer when he's no longer sharing the specific bond of two people destroying themselves in the same place? And then, with very little fanfare, Barney starts drinking again. An episode reintroduces him as the barfly he's always been, and the sobriety storyline is over. It's not killed dramatically. It just dissolves. He's at the bar. He has a beer. The show has moved on. This is, in its way, realistic. Recovery from alcoholism is not a single event followed by permanent transformation. People relapse. The path is not linear. There is a version of the Barney sobriety storyline that acknowledges this with honest nuance, that shows the difficulty of maintaining recovery in an environment structured entirely around the thing you're trying to stop doing, in a bar surrounded by friends whose relationship with you has been defined by shared drinking. But that version of the storyline would require the show to commit to Barney's recovery as a genuine ongoing narrative, rather than as a single episode arc. And the show was not prepared to commit to that. Barney as Barfly is easier to write than Barney in recovery. His role in the show's ecosystem is the affable drunk. Changing that role would require changing the ecosystem. So, the recovery happened and was abandoned. and Barney is still at the bar, and the film he made sits somewhere in the history of an episode that demonstrated what he could have been. The talent is still in there. The intelligence is still in there. Homer's oldest friend is still destroying himself on a bar stool, and the show decided it was easier to leave him there than to watch him try to leave. Moe Szyslak sits beside Barney in that tavern, and his story is its own archive of unfinished things. Moe's relationship history is a graveyard of hope. He falls in love. He enters relationships that seem, briefly, to offer him a way out of the specific isolation that defines his life. And every relationship ends, usually through his own inability to sustain what he's building, through the self-sabotage of a man who has spent so long believing himself unlovable that he can't let anything good get close enough to prove him wrong. There is an episode where Moe discovers a talent for bartending at a high level, for crafting cocktails that express genuine artistry, and briefly transforms the bar into something respected and celebrated. The episode ends and the bar goes back to being what it is. The talent doesn't leave him. The show just stops acknowledging it. There is a sustained suggestion across many seasons that Moe's ugliness, which the show uses as a constant source of jokes, is something he is genuinely and deeply hurt by. That the loneliness of his appearance is something that runs through his interior life with real pain. The show finds this funny, and sometimes it is funny, but sometimes it is genuinely sad. The portrait of a man whose relationship with his own body is one of the most significant obstacles in his life. And the show never gives Moe the thing that would resolve that. Not a love that lasts, not a relationship with himself that heals the self-loathing, not a version of his life in which the bar becomes something he loves rather than something he's trapped in. Moe is still behind the bar, still answering the phone, still receiving Bart's prank calls with increasing exasperation, still hoping, somewhere under the cynicism, that somebody will come in who changes the evening. He's been hoping that for 36 years. The bar closes at 2, the lights go off, and Moe goes upstairs to whatever room he has above the tavern, and the night is very quiet. We carry on. Section 13. Marge's hidden life, gambling, depression, and the woman behind the hair. The kitchen light at 742 Evergreen Terrace is almost never off. Marge Simpson is the keeper of this house. She is the one who makes sure the refrigerator is stocked and the children are accounted for, and the house maintains its structural integrity against the entropy that Homer and Bart generate at a remarkable rate. She is the one who holds things together, who fills in the gaps that the other family members leave, who manages the emotional temperature of a household that runs hot. She is also, in the full honesty of the show's more searching episodes, a person whose inner life is far more complicated than her surface suggests, and whose storylines of genuine personal struggle were repeatedly introduced and then allowed to subside without full resolution. The gambling addiction is the clearest example. The episode where Marge develops a gambling addiction at Mr. Burns's casino is one of the show's most honest examinations of what addiction actually looks like in someone you don't expect it to look like in. Marge is not Barney. She is not Homer reaching for a beer at the first sign of stress. She is the one who manages, who is reliable, who holds the line. And that is precisely what makes her addiction so interesting and so honest. She sits down at a slot machine and something happens that the show renders with real understanding. The noise and the lights and the rhythmic pull of the machine take something she's been carrying, the weight of constant responsibility, the exhaustion of being the person who makes everything work, and for a few hours that weight lifts. The machine doesn't need her to be competent or patient or present in the specific way her family does. It just needs her to be there, and she is there, and for a few hours being there is enough. The addiction escalates. She misses Christmas preparations. She stays at the casino past the point when she meant to leave. Homer and the kids manage without her, or rather, they try to manage and produce the kind of chaos that results from a household suddenly operating without its primary functional adult. The episode resolves, as the show's addiction episodes tend to resolve, with Marge acknowledging the problem and the family coming back together. There is a version of Marge's gambling addiction that is the foundation of a real, ongoing storyline, because addiction doesn't resolve in a single episode of recognition. The conditions that made the casino appealing don't change because she has acknowledged them. The weight she was carrying is still there. The relief the machine provided is something she now knows about herself and will have to actively manage for the rest of her life. The show knows this. It depicts it in passing in subsequent seasons. Marge's history with gambling is referenced occasionally, in ways that suggest the writers understand it hasn't been neatly resolved, but it's never the subject of sustained examination after its originating episode. The depression is even more important, and even more quietly handled. There is an episode, widely considered one of the series' finest, in which Marge's anxiety and depression become explicit enough that they require direct attention. She has been managing her mental health throughout the show's run in ways that the show depicts honestly without always naming directly. Her nervous eating, her compulsive cleaning, the specific way she processes stress by working harder and holding more, these are the behaviors of someone whose mental health has been under pressure for a very long time. When the show depicts her depression directly, it does so with genuine care. The episode is not comic. It treats Marge's experience with the seriousness it deserves. And it arrives at a solution that is, frankly, a bit too neat for what the episode has established. Because the narrative demands some resolution even if the clinical reality is more complicated. What the show never follows up on is Marge in therapy. Not as a one-episode premise, but as an ongoing fact of her life. Because a woman with Marge's history, with Marge's particular combination of stressors and her particular ways of managing them, would benefit enormously from ongoing support. The suggestion that her depression was addressed in a single episode is the show protecting the character's function. She needs to be available to hold the family together, and a Marge actively engaged with her own mental health needs, who might sometimes need to be held rather than to hold, is harder to write around. There are other threads in Marge's personal life that the show opened and left. Her artistic abilities, which the show establishes intermittently and then sets aside, the suggestion that she has a genuine visual gift that her domestic role has not allowed her to develop. There are episodes where she paints and the paintings are good, where she discovers that she is capable of something beyond management and caretaking. These episodes are wonderful, and they end, and Marge goes back to the kitchen. The show loves Marge. It treats her with real respect, but it also consistently subordinates her personal development to her family function. Every time an episode establishes something significant about who Marge is outside her role as wife and mother, the next episode resets. The artistic talent goes back in the drawer. The professional ambitions get sidelined. The woman who is not defined by her relationship to her husband and children doesn't get to stay in the frame for more than 22 minutes at a time. Her hair is still blue. It has always been blue. Nobody has ever fully explained why, though the show has gestured at it as an inherited characteristic. The hair is impractical and implausible, and she has maintained it in exactly the same shape for 36 years, which is, among other things, a metaphor for the way she maintains herself. Everything in the exact same configuration, everything held exactly as it has always been held. The woman under the hair is still there. The one who sits at the gambling machine and feels the weight lift. The one who picks up a brush and makes something beautiful. The one who lies awake at 3 in the morning wondering what her life would look like if she had made different choices. Not bad choices, just different ones. She is still there. She is always still there. Section 14. Bart's Lost Futures. Every path the show abandoned. Bart Simpson is 10 years old and he has already been to military school, attempted to run for class president, started a business empire, discovered a hidden talent for art, formed a band, fallen in love multiple times, nearly moved to France, led a small rebellion against Springfield's school system, nearly accidentally destroyed a foreign country, and lost, in passing, more opportunities for real transformation than most adults get in a lifetime. The remarkable thing about Bart is not that he is in trouble. It is that the show keeps showing you the person he could become if any of these experiences were allowed to stick. Military school is the clearest example. The episode where Bart is sent to the Rommelwood Military Academy is one of the show's most searching examinations of who Bart actually is under the performance of troublemaking. He arrives hostile and resistant, which is what you would expect from a kid who has been sent somewhere he didn't choose. And then, slowly, he begins to respond to the structure. Not because the military academy has broken him, but because the specific environment of genuine rigor and shared difficulty turns out to offer him something he doesn't get at Springfield Elementary. He's good at it. The physical challenges, the discipline required to perform under pressure, the social dynamics of a group organized around something more demanding than casual friendship, these things bring out abilities in Bart that Springfield has never asked him to use. He is, it turns out, naturally gifted at leadership when the environment requires real leadership, rather than just the social navigation of an elementary school. The episode ends before the transformation is complete. Bart leaves the academy, or circumstances remove him from it, and he returns to Springfield and to his established role as the town's foremost juvenile problem. The abilities revealed by the military school don't carry forward in any systematic way. The version of Bart who was thriving in that environment doesn't get to come home and discover what he could build with those abilities in a context he actually chooses. There is a version of Bart's story in which the military school episode is the beginning of a longer arc about him finding something he's genuinely good at and deciding, for the first time in his life, to commit to it. Not because it's easy, but because committing to something hard and being good at it is a feeling he has never had before and can't quite walk away from. The show doesn't tell this story. It offers the episode and then puts Bart back. His talent for art is another thread that deserves more than it got. In an episode where Bart discovers that he has a genuine eye, a real capacity for visual observation and rendering, the show takes this seriously. The paintings and drawings he produces are not played as jokes about a delinquent accidentally making something good. They are presented as evidence of a real ability, one that his elementary school environment has never bothered to notice or encourage because Bart's behavior has made it easy to write him off entirely. The art teacher who recognizes his talent is a character who briefly offers Bart what Langdon offered Lisa: the experience of being seen accurately by an adult who cares what they're seeing. It changes something in how Bart sees himself, or could change something. The episode suggests the beginning of that change, and then the episode ends, and Bart puts down the pencil, and the artistic talent goes back into the category of things Springfield knows about its residents and declines to do anything with. The romantic threads in Bart's history are numerous and mostly unresolved. He has had feelings for girls that the show treats with varying degrees of seriousness. The most significant of these, in terms of the show's own investment, is probably his relationship with a French girl named Greta Wolfcastle, the daughter of a celebrity. The episode about Bart and Greta touches on what it means to have someone from a completely different world be genuinely interested in you, the specific disorientation of feeling chosen by someone you didn't expect to choose you. It ends without resolution in the way that Bart's romantic stories always end, without resolution. There's also the question of what Bart believes about his own future. The flash-forward episodes show him in various states, some of them genuinely bleak, some of them suggesting something harder to categorize. He is sometimes shown as a drifter, someone who never found a direction and settled into directionlessness with the familiar ease of someone whose early habits never shifted. He is sometimes shown as finding something, a purpose, a person, a version of himself that the chaos of his Springfield years eventually cleared the way for. The show can imagine Bart growing up in many directions. It has done so repeatedly. What it hasn't done is commit to any one of them, or to the deeper question of what would have to change in Bart's life for the better versions of his future to become possible. He is still 10 years old. The flash-forwards are hypotheticals, what-ifs, glimpses through windows that close before you can climb through them. In the permanent present of Springfield, Bart is still at his desk, still looking out the window, still writing "I will not do" whatever he did on the chalkboard. But the evidence of who he could be is accumulated across 36 seasons. It's all there. The military discipline, the artistic talent, the genuine warmth he shows when he lets himself be genuine, the capacity for loyalty that goes beyond self-interest when the situation is serious enough to bring it out. Bart Simpson, fully realized, would be someone worth knowing. The show has proven this, in flashes, for 3 decades. He's still waiting for the episode that doesn't end before he gets there. Section 15. The characters who walked into Springfield and never left or left too soon. The town of Springfield has, over 36 seasons, accumulated a population that is one of the most densely inhabited landscapes in American fiction. Walk down any Springfield street and you will pass people whose names you know even if you can't place the episode, whose faces are familiar even if their last major storyline was 15 seasons ago. Some of these people walked in with real purpose and then faded. Others were clearly meant to be temporary and became fixtures. And some arrived with such force that their absence, when it came, left a specific shape in the air that the show never quite filled. Mindy Simmons is one of these. She is introduced in the episode The Last Temptation of Homer as Homer's co-worker, a woman who is, improbably, exactly Homer's type in every specific way. She likes beer. She watches television. Her preferred dinner is a hot dog. She has the same casual relationship with ambition that Homer has. She is, in the show's own framing, Homer's female equivalent. The episode that introduces her is one of the show's most honest examinations of the specific nature of temptation, of what it means to encounter someone who feels like a version of yourself that fate might have married, in a context where you are already married to someone very different. Homer genuinely struggles with his feelings for Mindy because his feelings are real. The show doesn't make him villainous for having them, and it doesn't make the feelings vanish conveniently. He is someone who has met someone he is genuinely attracted to and has to decide what to do about that. The resolution is that Homer chooses Marge. The choice is made clearly. And then Mindy leaves the show entirely. Her presence in Homer's workplace apparently concluded by the end of the episode that introduced her. This is a storytelling decision that sidesteps the more complicated question of what it means for Homer to work in the same building as someone he had to actively choose not to pursue. That choice, having been made, continues to be operative for as long as Mindy is around. Her presence would require Homer to keep choosing, to keep making the decision in the various small ways that maintaining a choice requires when the option you didn't take is still visible. Removing her removes the ongoing pressure of that choice, which makes the resolution tidier but also less honest than the episode itself was. She was too good a character to be an episode's device, but that is what she became. Sideshow Bob's nemesis from before Bart, Sideshow Bob's original crimes, is a thread the show opens and closes too quickly. The history of what Bob did before his relationship with the Simpson family is depicted in fragments that suggest he was never simply a failed clown. He had a life, a background, reasons for the rage that eventually turned criminal. The show has never traced that history fully. There is a teacher at Springfield Elementary beyond Mrs. Krabappel, whose presence in certain seasons suggested the show was building something and then abandoned. There are Springfield residents who appear in the background of many episodes, who have names that fans have cataloged, who the show has occasionally given specific moments, and who represent the richest possible territory for a show that has always been better when it trusts the depth of its world. The recurring characters, who were clearly given more development as the show was actively deciding what to do with them, are fascinating to trace. You can see the show trying them out, giving them dialogue and storyline weight in one season, and then making a quiet decision that they don't quite fit the show's ongoing needs. Mayor Quimby is a figure who deserved more than he got. He is, in the show's established universe, a deeply corrupt politician, and the show's satire of American political corruption through him is consistent and pointed. But the corruption is played broadly, as broad comedy, without the show ever fully committing to the darker implications of what it's depicting. A mayor who is genuinely and systematically corrupt, who is accountable to Burns and to the power structures above the democratic surface of Springfield's governance, is a character with more story to tell than the show typically bothers to tell. His personal life, which the show hints at in scattered episodes, is an archive of unresolved material. His family, his history, the specific path from wherever he came from to the mayor's office, the things he traded for the position he holds, none of this has been examined with any depth. These are the people who populate the town, the ones who made it feel real, the ones whose lives ran alongside the Simpson families and suggested a world that extended beyond the frame. Springfield is full of them, these almost characters, these people who were given enough detail to make you curious and not enough to make you satisfied. They live there. They go about their days. They fill the background of scenes that are really about someone else. And their stories, the full versions of their stories, the ones that would require their own episodes and their own sustained attention, are still out there somewhere, waiting to be told. The night is very deep now. The town is as quiet as it gets, which is not completely quiet because the plant is always humming and the sign at the Quick E-Mart never goes dark, but quiet enough for the last section. Section 16, the finale that never came what Springfield was always building toward. This is the last section. And in a show about things that never end, it feels appropriate to spend the final part of the night thinking about endings. About what The Simpsons might have been building toward across 36 seasons if the show had been designed to conclude. Because the remarkable thing, when you sit with the show's entire run as a single object, is how much of it was pointing somewhere. Not in the way of a serialized drama with a planned conclusion, not in the way of a show whose writers always knew where they were going, but in the deeper, quieter way that any sustained work of art accumulates meaning over time, building themes and relationships and recurring images that, if you could freeze the progression at any point and ask what all of this is for, would give you an answer. What The Simpsons has always been building toward is a single question. What happens to a family when the world changes but the family can't? Homer and Marge got married because Marge was pregnant with Bart. This is established in multiple flashback episodes with varying details, but the core fact is consistent. They were young, they were not necessarily planning on each other, and then a child was coming and the marriage was the structure they built around that fact. The love in the marriage is real. The show has always made this clear. But the foundation of the structure was necessity. What does a marriage look like 30 years later, when the necessity has long since resolved into habit? When the people in it have become so familiar with each other that the familiarity itself is both the greatest comfort and the greatest risk? When the children who created the structure are now 10 years old forever in the floating timeline, but are also conceptually growing, becoming people with their own trajectories? The show has circled this question hundreds of times. It has put Homer and Marge's marriage under pressure consistently, in ways ranging from the broadly comic to the genuinely frightening. The gambling episode, the depression episodes, the various infidelity near misses on both sides, the episodes where the marriage is clearly in serious trouble and the resolution requires real work rather than cartoon convenience. And every time, the marriage survives. Every time, the family reassembles. Every time, the credits roll and 742 Evergreen Terrace is still standing, the lights still on. The show has never allowed itself to ask what would happen if the marriage didn't survive, not as a permanent outcome, not as the show's actual conclusion. Because the show can't end. The premise that makes the show possible, the floating timeline, the eternal present, means there is no natural conclusion available to it. The story of a family is a story with an implied ending. The children grow up and leave, the parents grow old, the house on Evergreen Terrace passes to someone else. This is the natural arc of a family. The Simpsons cannot reach it, but all the unresolved storylines we've spent this night with are pointing in the direction of that arc anyway. Bart's lost futures are all futures in which he eventually grows up and becomes someone. Lisa's love stories are practice for the love she'll find when she's old enough and somewhere she can be fully received. Maggie's silence is a preparation for a voice. Marge's hidden life, the gambling, the art, the depression, is the life of a woman waiting for a moment when the family no longer requires her to hold herself so precisely in place. Homer, asleep in his chair, with the television on and the beer beside him, is a man whose life has been both exactly what it is and the dream of something better, simultaneously, for decades. He has failed upward through catastrophe after catastrophe. He has been loved by a woman who should, by every practical measure, have left. He has fathered children who are, in their different ways, extraordinary. He has survived everything Springfield has done to him and done to itself. The story the show is always building toward, if you follow the threads far enough, is a story about what love costs and what it's worth. About a family that has been put under extraordinary pressure, by circumstances and by its own most characteristic failures, and has stayed together anyway. Not because it was easy, not because the show protected them, but because they kept choosing each other in the specific small ways that choosing happens. Every episode, every season, every year. The unresolved storylines are not failures of the show's design. They are the show being honest about the nature of life. Life is full of unresolved storylines. People you knew who moved away without a proper ending to your friendship. Relationships that faded rather than concluded. Promises made in good faith that circumstances made impossible to keep. Talents discovered and not developed. Paths taken partway and then abandoned for a different path that also turned out to be abandoned. The Simpsons has accumulated 36 years of this, which means it has accumulated something like a complete portrait of a life. Not one life, but the life of a family, the aggregate life of a town, the massive, improbably detailed account of what it looks like to exist in a particular place and time and not always know what you're doing. The finale that never came would have been the moment when all of this accumulated to its natural weight. When Bart turned 11. When Lisa turned 9. When Homer walked out of the plant for the last time, probably by accident rather than by choice, and found himself standing on the steps of a building that had always been his entire professional world, wondering what came next. When Marge picked up a brush for reasons that were hers alone, it would have been probably the greatest episode in the history of American television, because the show had been building it for decades, one unresolved thread at a time, and the resolution of all of those threads simultaneously would have been something genuinely overwhelming. It will never happen. The show will continue. Springfield will remain in its floating present, its residents unchanged, its stories perpetually in the middle of themselves. But the ending is there, potential and complete, somewhere in the space between what the show has depicted and what it can't quite bring itself to do. It sits in the gap between Frank Grimes's grave and the nuclear plant that killed him, between Ling Bouvier's crib and the woman Selma thought she'd become, between Barney's sobriety and the bar stool he went back to, between Lisa's saxophone and the stage she hasn't reached yet, between Homer asleep in his chair and the moment he opens his eyes. The ending is there. We just keep choosing not to arrive at it. And maybe that's right. Maybe the point of Springfield has always been the not arriving, the living in the middle, the insistence that the family is still together and the house is still standing and there is still a next episode, still another Sunday night, still one more time around before anything has to end. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still 1, her enormous eyes watching everything, saying nothing, waiting for the moment she decides to speak. Homer is asleep. Marge has turned off the light in the kitchen. The plant is still humming behind the cooling towers. The quick E-Mart sign is still on. The town is as quiet as it gets. And somewhere in the permanent present of 742 Evergreen Terrace, in the floating timeline of a town that doesn't appear on any map, in the dream of a man who may or may not have been dreaming since 1993, the Simpsons are still together. The story is still going. And you can rest now. Let Springfield hold you for a while. Let the stories that were started and not finished drift around you the way old memories do, present and soft, and not requiring any resolution tonight. The threads are still there. They'll still be there in the morning. Bart's skateboard is on the porch. Lisa's saxophone is propped beside her bed. The television at 742 is still on, a soft blue light through the window. The night is deep and still. Marge will be in the kitchen before long. Rest now. Additional section: Krusty's Jewish identity and the comedy that was never fully told. There is a version of the Krusty storyline that the show assembled the pieces for and then declined to build. Krusty's Jewish identity is, when the show engages with it honestly, one of its richest sources of genuine emotional material. He is the son of a rabbi. He grew up in a deeply observant household, and he chose to become a clown, which is the most archetypal thing a Jewish comedian in the American tradition has ever done, and the show knows it. The self-deprecating Jewish comedian who uses laughter as a defense against pain is one of the oldest and most explored types in American entertainment. What makes Krusty interesting is that the show gives him this background while also making him deeply incompetent at being the kind of person that background would typically produce. He is not wise. He is not self-aware. He does not use his pain productively in the way that the best comics in the tradition he belongs to have. He uses it destructively, turning it into self-medication and self-sabotage rather than into the comedy that illuminates. His estrangement from his father was the show's most direct engagement with what it might mean to grow up in a household like the Krustovskis and become what Krusty became. And the reconciliation episode is beautiful, genuinely, in the way that the show's best moments are beautiful. The pain is real. The relief of the reconciliation is real. The episode earns everything it spends. But the reconciliation happened, and then the relationship it produced was barely examined. What were the remaining years of Rabbi Krustovsky's life like in relationship with his son? What did they talk about? What did the rabbi make of his son's career, now that he had chosen to be present for it? What did Krusty make of his father's presence after decades of absence? These questions are not trivial. They are the heart of what the storyline was building. The reconciliation was the door opening. The show never stepped through it. There is also something worth sitting with about what it means that Krusty is one of the few Jewish characters in mainstream American animated television to have a Jewish identity that is substantive rather than incidental. The show has done real things with this, occasionally. Krusty's relationship to his faith, to his culture, to the specific humor that comes from that cultural tradition, is a thread that the show has pulled enough to reveal its length and then decline to follow to the end. The comedy Krusty actually produces in his show within the show is deliberately terrible. It is lazy, lowest common denominator entertainment that Krusty produces with the specific exhaustion of someone who stopped caring about the work a long time ago. But the show hints, occasionally, that this was not always true. That there was a version of Krusty who made people laugh through craft and genuine feeling rather than through the accumulated inertia of a long-running franchise. What happened to that Krusty? At what point did the craft stop mattering? At what point did the estrangement from his father, and whatever else happened in his life, translate into the contempt for his own work that now characterizes everything he does professionally? The show has given us the clown and the man inside the clown in fragments. It has never given us the complete picture of how one became the other. Herschel Kristofsky stands in the lights of his own set and makes children laugh at jokes he stopped finding funny years ago. The costume fits perfectly because he has been wearing it so long. The laugh track follows every punchline, whether the punchline deserves it or not. Behind the grease paint, a rabbi's son is still in there somewhere, carrying a history the show assembled and then set aside. The lights are still on, the cameras are still rolling, he is still on the air. Additional section. Grandpa Simpson and the weight of everything he remembers. Abe Simpson lives in a retirement home. He has lived in a retirement home for 36 years. He remembers things that nobody else in Springfield remembers because most of Springfield wasn't alive yet when the things he remembers were happening. He fought in World War II. He says this in many episodes, and the specific details of what he did in the war shift depending on the episode, which the show treats as a joke about Abe's unreliable memory and the floating timeline's inability to maintain consistent backstory, but which also inadvertently creates a portrait of a man whose past keeps changing shape on him. Abe is one of the show's most genuinely poignant characters, when the show allows him to be. He is a man who has become invisible in the way that old people become invisible, not through any dramatic erasure but through the gradual withdrawal of attention. He has things to say. He has stories to tell. He has a lifetime of accumulated experience that Homer and the grandchildren occasionally engage with and more often move past. The relationship between Abe and Homer is one of the most unresolved emotional threads in the series. Homer's relationship with his own father is, at its core, a story about a son who spent his adult life defined by the feeling of not being known. Homer's mother left. His father was there but was not always present in the way Homer needed, was not always capable of providing the specific kind of attention and love that Homer's particular character required. The result is a Homer who is deeply hungry for approval, who will do almost anything to be liked, who cannot easily sit with the discomfort of disappointing someone. This is, transparently, Abe's legacy. The kind of father Abe was, the specific ways he was present and absent, shaped Homer in the most fundamental ways, and the show knows this. It has depicted it, in passing and in detail, across many seasons. But the full reckoning between Homer and Abe has never happened. There have been episodes that gesture toward it, episodes where Homer is genuinely tender with his father, episodes where Abe's frailty makes Homer face things he usually avoids. But the honest accounting, the conversation between a father and a son about what the father didn't provide and what the son needed, and what both of them have carried as a result, has never fully taken place. Abe also carries the secret of the deal he made with Burns. We discussed this in the context of Mona's storyline. The contractual arrangement between Abe and Burns, traded for Homer's guaranteed employment, is something Homer has never been told and Abe has never confessed. It is a piece of deception that spans decades and has shaped Homer's entire professional life, without Homer ever understanding the mechanism. The moment Abe tells Homer the truth, or the moment Homer discovers it on his own, would be one of the most significant scenes in the show's history. The revelation that his employment was guaranteed not by his own labor or merit, but by a deal his father made with the man who destroyed his family, that Burns and Abe have been linked in Homer's life in this way all along, this would be the kind of reckoning the show has been setting up for seasons without ever delivering. It would also be the scene in which the full weight of what Burns has done to the Simpson family could be named. Not comically, not through theories and implications, but directly and clearly, this man took your mother, he ruined your potential, He kept you small and manageable through a combination of environmental poisoning and strategic poverty, and your father made a deal with him because your father didn't know how else to protect you. This conversation has never happened. Abe still carries the secret. Homer still doesn't know. Burns is still at the top of the plant, still signing Homer's checks, still not remembering his name. The debt that the Simpson family owes and is owed, the full ledger of what Burns has done and what Abe enabled and what Homer has lived in the aftermath of, is still open. Abe is still in the retirement home, still telling stories that nobody listens to all the way through, still carrying things that Homer needs to know and has never been told. He is the oldest person in a family that never ages, and his years are the realest thing in Springfield. The night is very quiet around the retirement home. The lights in the residence rooms are off one by one. Abe is the last one still awake, probably, sitting in the common room with the television on, watching something he's seen before, from a year that most people only know as history. He remembers everything. He just can't always find the right moment to say it. Additional section. The town itself, what Springfield knows and will never say. Before we close, spend a moment with Springfield itself. Not its residents, not its storylines, but the town as an entity, the place as a character. Springfield has been through extraordinary things. We have cataloged some of them in the course of this night, but the full list is almost incomprehensible. It has been invaded by a monorail that nearly destroyed it, and a dome that sealed it, and a comet that almost ended it. It has had its sun blocked. It has been flooded. It has been rebuilt from destruction multiple times. It has been at the center of political scandals and environmental disasters and events that in the real world would leave permanent marks on a community's identity and culture. And it resets. Every time. The reset is the show's most basic structural mechanism and also its deepest philosophical position. Springfield forgets because forgetting is the only way to continue. A town that remembered everything that has happened to it would be a town in a permanent state of trauma. The forgetting is not a failure of the community. It is, in some fundamental way, the community's most impressive achievement. The ability to begin again, to face the next week with the specific amnesia that makes it possible to treat the next disaster as the first disaster rather than the latest one. But the forgetting also means that nothing is ever properly processed. Nothing is grieved. Nothing is learned. The town makes the same mistakes over and over with a clean conscience because the memory of the previous mistake is not available to inform the new decision. The three-eyed fish is still in the river. The plant is still leaking. Burns is still alive. Homer is still asleep in Sector 7G. The cooling towers are still cracked, patched with whatever is available, maintained at the level of minimum operational function. And the town knows this, or it doesn't know it, or it knows it in the way that makes knowing something and acting on it two completely separate things. Springfield is the most thoroughly documented case of collective amnesia in the history of fiction. Every catastrophe carefully depicted, every recovery carefully depicted, and the gap between the two filled with nothing, no learning, no accumulation, no progression, just the next episode beginning. But that's not entirely right either. Because the show has built, over 36 years, a richness of world and character that is itself a kind of progression. Even if the characters don't grow, the audience's understanding of them deepens. Even if Springfield doesn't remember its disasters, the audience accumulates them. The show's history is the history we carry for it, since it can't carry its own. We are Springfield's memory. That's what being a long-term viewer means. We remember when Maude was alive. We remember when Barney was sober. We remember Frank Grimes and what he discovered and what it cost him. We remember Herb Powell and the car and the reconciliation. We remember Lisa's substitute teacher, and Bart's art, and Apu's 8 children, and Ling's arrival at the Bouvier apartment, and all the other things the show put on screen and then moved past. The show generated these things. It committed them to tape, and it trusted that someone would be watching. Someone would remember. Someone would hold the archive. That's us. We are the memory Springfield doesn't have. And the unresolved storylines, all the threads we followed tonight, all the endings that never came, they are the most honest part of what the show has made. Because life doesn't resolve. Stories don't close neatly. People you cared about are still out there somewhere living the rest of their stories without a camera on them, and what they're doing and who they've become is real, even if you can't see it. Nelson Muntz is still there, still carrying whatever he carries, still laughing that laugh. Frank Grimes Jr. is still there, still the son of a man nobody remembers. Herb Powell is still there, still Homer's brother. Still the other half of a connection that Homer probably thinks about less often than he should. Ling Bouvier is still there, Selma's daughter, a Chinese girl in Springfield, growing up in the gaps between episodes. Barney is still at the bar, still somewhere inside the alcoholism, the person who made that film. Krusty is still in the lights, still Herschel, behind the grease paint. Marge is still in the kitchen, still holding things together that would fall apart without her. And somewhere in the hospital wing of Springfield General, or in the specific corner of the eternal present where his hospital bed exists, Homer Simpson is still dreaming, still holding his family in the dream, still refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream stops, if the simulation finally closes, then there's just the room, just the machines, just the sound of a man's breathing, and his family sitting beside him, and the years that have passed while he was somewhere else. Homer doesn't want to be somewhere else. He wants to be home. He always wants to be home. And in Springfield, he always is. Close. The night is ending now, or its deepest, depending on the hour you arrived at this point. Springfield is still there. It will always be there. The plant is still humming. The Quick E-Mart is still glowing. The couch at 742 Evergreen Terrace is still the couch where the family lands, together every episode, the anchor of the world. The stories we walk through tonight are real stories. They are the real stories of The Simpsons, the ones underneath the jokes, the ones that were started and never finished, the ones that live in the space between what the show depicted and what it didn't quite allow itself to become. They will keep. Stories like these always keep, and you can rest now. Let Springfield drift around you the way a familiar neighborhood does when you're almost asleep. The sounds you know, the lights you recognize, the shapes of buildings that have been part of your world for so long. You don't consciously register them anymore, but would miss them the moment they were gone. The show is still going. The family is still together. The loop is still floating. And somewhere in the permanent, gentle light of a Sunday night in Springfield, Bart is still 10 years old, and Lisa is still 8, and Maggie's enormous eyes are still watching everything she will someday know how to name. Good night, Springfield. Good night. End of script. Total word count target, 40,000 plus words. Expansion, Section 1. Continued the deeper world of Springfield Elementary and the children the show left behind. Let's stay a little longer in the world of Springfield Elementary, because there is more here than we covered and the hour is still young enough for it. There is a whole social ecosystem at that school that functions as its own closed universe, with its own power structures and its own language and its own unwritten laws about who belongs where and why. The show dips into this universe regularly and extracts what it needs for any given episode, but the full texture of what it built is richer than any single episode can capture. Nelson's situation, which we discussed earlier, becomes even more interesting when you consider the ways the show repeatedly gave him access to something warmer and then withdrew it. There is a recurring pattern in Nelson's appearances where the episode requires him to do something kind or to respond to kindness, and the genuine sweetness that emerges in those moments is so at odds with his established role as threat and bully that it lands with the specific force of something true. He's not performing being kind. He just is, in those moments, someone who is responding honestly to having been treated decently. The episode where Lisa takes an interest in Nelson is the clearest expression of this, but it's not the only one. There are scattered moments across many seasons where Nelson's behavior suggests a person who would make different choices if different choices were available to him, where the bullying is revealed as a set of habits built in a specific environment rather than an expression of who he fundamentally is. What does it mean that the show consistently demonstrated this and then consistently returned him to the bully role? Part of it is the show's relationship with its own established characterizations, which it is reluctant to permanently alter because permanent alteration requires ongoing maintenance. If Nelson becomes genuinely kinder, you have to write him as genuinely kinder in every subsequent episode. If he remains a bully, you can use him as a comedic obstacle whenever the plot requires one. The practical pressure of weekly episodic television always pulls toward the function over the depth. But there is something lost in that choice, and the loss accumulates over 36 seasons into something significant. Nelson's life has been depicted as genuinely difficult. His parents are absent. His home is inadequate. His social environment doesn't offer him many models for how to be different from what he is. The show has documented this honestly and repeatedly. The story of a child in those circumstances being given genuine opportunity, being seen accurately by someone who cared what they saw, and changing as a result, is not a story The Simpsons told about Nelson. It gestured toward it many times. It never committed. There is also something worth examining in the dynamic between Bart and the other members of his social group that the show established and then gradually let dissolve. In the early seasons, the 4 or 5 kids at the center of Bart's world had something close to a stable group identity. They went on adventures together. They had the specific kind of bond that forms between children who spend most of their waking hours in proximity, the bond of shared geography and shared history rather than of active choice. As the show progressed, Bart's storylines became increasingly his own. The other kids became less consistently present. The show's focus narrowed to the individual rather than the group, which made sense from a narrative perspective because Bart is the show's primary focus in that generation. But it meant that the texture of what it was like to be a kid in Springfield, the full map of that social world, faded from the show as the seasons accumulated. Database, whose real name is Augustus, is a character who represents this fade most clearly. He exists, he has a name, the show knows who he is in the structure of Springfield Elementary's social ecosystem, but his inner life is essentially unmapped. He appears in crowd scenes, in class, in the background of episodes that need a kid with his specific function. But who he is, what his family is like, what he thinks about, what he cares about, these questions have never been seriously engaged with. There was a moment in the show's history when it seemed like Database might get the kind of development that would make him a real character rather than a category. He appeared in enough episodes, and with enough consistency, that the groundwork for development existed. It just never happened. Springfield Elementary itself is a character in this story too, and it is a character with its own unresolved threads. The school has been, at various points, the site of significant institutional failures that the show depicts and then moves past. The oil well discovered under the school's grounds, which Burns steals, destroying the school's funding and setting in motion the events that lead to the Who Shot Mr. Burns' storyline is the most dramatic example. The school's budget is devastated. Its programs are cut. The children's educational experience is genuinely harmed. And then, through various mechanisms, things largely return to normal, and the oil well and its implications drift away from the show's active concerns. The long-term effect on Springfield Elementary's institutional quality of years of underfunding and administrative instability is never examined. Principal Skinner manages the school with a mixture of genuine dedication and obvious limitation, and the limitations that Burns's various depredations have created for the school are accepted as background fact rather than ongoing emergency. There is a story about public education in America embedded in Springfield Elementary's history, about what happens to children's institutions when they are treated as less important than the economic interests of the powerful people in their vicinity. The show knows this story. It introduced the material, it just didn't commit to telling the story all the way through. Superintendent Chalmers is another figure in this world whose potential for real storytelling was largely squandered in favor of his comedic function. He exists primarily as Skinner's superior, the authority that Skinner fears and performs competence for, and his appearances are usually organized around the joke of Skinner trying to maintain an appearance of normality while something catastrophic unfolds behind him. The joke is funny. The joke has been funny for 36 seasons, but Chalmers is also a man with a job that would, in reality, involve real decisions about real children's lives. What does he actually believe about education? What drove him to this career? What does he think, privately, about the school district he oversees, about the resources available, about the outcomes he sees? The show has given him a home life, in glimpses, a suggestion of a wife, a sense of a domestic existence separate from the Skinner relationship. These glimpses are interesting precisely because they suggest someone more complex than his comedic function requires. But they are glimpses, never developed, never followed. One last Springfield Elementary thread before we move on. Mrs. Hoover. Elizabeth Hoover is Lisa's teacher. She is, by every metric the show has established, not a good teacher. She is burnt out, disengaged, present in body but long since absent in spirit. She has clearly stopped caring about her students in any individual sense and is delivering the minimum required to maintain her employment. She smokes, she drinks, she treats her students' achievements and struggles with the same level of attention, which is minimal. And yet Lisa, who is in her class, who is brilliant and starved for genuine intellectual engagement, has to spend her school days in a room managed by someone who has given up. The irony of this, the specific cruelty of it, is something the show depicts clearly. Lisa is precisely the kind of student who should be the joy of a teacher's career, the child whose abilities make teaching feel like it matters. And she is in the class of a woman who couldn't care less. What does this do to Lisa? The show's answer is that it makes her struggle harder, become more self-directed, find her intellectual nourishment outside the classroom. This is probably accurate to who Lisa is, but it doesn't examine what it costs. What it means to be 8 years old, and acutely aware that the person whose job is to educate you is not doing that job, and that you are on your own in the most important room of your daily life. Mrs. Hoover's backstory, the professional decline that turned an presumably once engaged teacher into the hollow presence she is now, is hinted at without being examined. There was a person who chose this career for reasons that made sense at the time. Something happened to that person. The show knows this and uses it for jokes and occasionally for something more, but it doesn't trace the arc. She is still in that classroom. Lisa is still in that classroom. The ceiling tiles are still the same ceiling tiles they've been since 1989. And something important about both of them is still waiting to be said. Now let's breathe and go a little deeper into the geography of the town, because Springfield is not just its people. It is also its places, and the places have their own histories and their own unresolved stories. Expansion. Section 2 continued the full weight of the Bouvier sisters and their unfinished becoming. We spent time earlier with Ling and with the adoption, but the Bouvier sisters carry more than the adoption in their unfinished history, and it deserves more space. Selma has been married 7 times, depending on how you count. She has wanted a family with a persistence that the show treats as pathological and as deeply human in equal measure. The humor around her marriage history is gentle in its better moments, acknowledging that what she is doing is not absurd but rather the logical response of a person whose desire for connection keeps being thwarted by the specific people she chooses. The choice of people is itself interesting. She marries celebrities and criminals and men whose defining characteristic is that they are clearly wrong for her. There is a version of a story about Selma in which you examine why she keeps choosing wrong, what the pattern reveals about what she actually believes she deserves, whether on some level her self-image is so damaged by years of the specific indignities of her life at the DMV and her appearance and her cynicism that she can only pursue relationships she believes will fail because a successful relationship would require her to believe she was worth. 1. This is not the story the show tells. The show uses Selma's marriage history as a source of escalating comedy, each marriage more disastrously funny than the last, without asking the harder question of what the pattern means. The question is implied. It sits underneath every failed marriage. But the show is too kind to Selma, in one sense, to force her to confront it directly. There is also Selma's relationship with her own health that deserves examination. She smokes constantly. This is a source of regular comedy, her voice deepened by decades of cigarettes, her apartment perpetually wreathed in smoke. But the show has also acknowledged, in passing, that the smoking has consequences for her health. There are episodes where her health is mentioned, where the long-term effects of her habits are gestured at. The show never follows this to a serious conclusion, because the serious conclusion, a character dealing with smoking-related illness, would require a kind of sustained commitment to one character's welfare that the show reserves for its main family. Selma and Patty are important to the show, but they are not its center, and the resources of narrative attention go where the center is. But the neglect of Selma's health storyline means that a real consequence of a real choice is being depicted without examination. She smokes. The smoking is bad for her. The show acknowledges this in jokes. What would it look like to take it seriously? Patty's storyline after her coming out is similarly incomplete. She had relationships in the seasons after the episode that revealed her sexuality, but the show's interest in those relationships was episodic rather than sustained. The question of what it means to have lived your whole life not fully out, to have maintained a performance of a kind of person you weren't, and then to have stopped performing is rich territory. What does Patty actually feel in the years after about the years before? Does she grieve for time spent differently than she might have spent it? Does she feel relief? Does her relationship with Marge change now that this fact about her is part of their sisterhood in a way it wasn't before? The show visits these questions once or twice and then moves on. Patty returns to being Patty, which is comforting and funny and slightly incomplete. And underneath all of this is the relationship between the two sisters themselves, which is perhaps the most genuinely interesting relationship in the show's supporting cast and one of the least examined. Patty and Selma are twins. They have been together their entire lives. They share an apartment, they work in the same office, they have been each other's primary company through decades of adult life. This level of closeness between two adults who are not a romantic couple is unusual enough that it deserves real examination, and the show's treatment of it tends toward comedy about how suffocating it might be, rather than genuine curiosity about what it is. What does it mean to be each other's closest person? To have chosen, implicitly or explicitly, to structure your adult life around a sibling rather than around a partner? There are episodes where the dynamic between them is genuinely interesting, where their different personalities and different desires create real friction that the show treats with care. Selma wanted a husband and children. Patty seemed less interested in those particular structures. How has that difference expressed itself in how they live together? The apartment they share is one of the show's most familiar locations outside the Simpson family home, and it is a space with its own character. Cluttered, smoke-infused, organized around their shared habits and their divergent needs. It is a place that feels completely lived in, completely specific, completely real in the way that only spaces actually inhabited by real people feel. And somewhere in that apartment, Ling is growing up. Surrounded by two women whose lives were organized in a particular way before she arrived and are being reorganized, slowly and imperfectly, in the aftermath of her arrival. The show has given us the apartment. It has given us the sisters. It has given us Ling's arrival and the joy that accompanied it. What it hasn't given us is the family in motion, the day-to-day of what Patty and Selma have become, as mothers, as the adults in this new configuration. The specific ways having a child has changed how they talk to each other, what they argue about, what they prioritize, when their priorities used to be organized entirely differently. This is the story of the Bouvier apartment, and it is one of the show's most complete unexplored territories. Expansion. Section 3. Continued what Frank Grimes meant to the show's self-understanding. The conversation around Homer's enemy doesn't end with Frank Grimes himself, or even with his son. It extends to something the episode made unavoidable, which is the question of what kind of show The Simpsons was willing to be. Homer's enemy was, among other things, a test. The writers put the show under pressure in a very deliberate way, introducing a character whose entire function was to make Homer's life look like what it would look like from outside the cartoon's protective logic. Frank is reality, Homer is the show, and the show killed reality. The decision to kill Frank Grimes is interesting not just as a narrative choice, but as a statement about what the show refused to become. A Frank Grimes who survived, who continued working at the plant, who was a persistent presence in Homer's working life, would require the show to engage ongoing with the dissonance Frank represents. Homer could not simply be Homer in a show where Frank Grimes was an ongoing character, because Frank's presence would make Homer's lapses and failures legible as harmful rather than as charming. The show chose not to live with that. It removed Frank rather than change Homer. And this choice, which is entirely understandable from a practical storytelling perspective, had consequences for what the show allowed itself to be. In the seasons following Homer's enemy, there is a gradual shift in how Homer's incompetence and self-involvement are presented. The show gets more comfortable with consequences being external to Homer, happening to other characters while Homer remains largely untouched. The circle of genuine accountability tightens around Homer, and the people outside that circle, the Frank Grimeses, the casualties, become increasingly invisible. This is not a complete description of what happened to the show in its later seasons, which is a complicated and debated question. But the Frank Grimes decision is a point on the arc, a moment when the show explicitly chose what it was going to protect and what it was going to sacrifice. The writers knew what they were doing. The episode is too smart not to know. They built Frank as a mirror, and then destroyed the mirror, and put Homer back in a room with nothing reflective in it. And Frank Jr. is still out there, presumably, still the son of that mirror, still carrying the question of whether his father's understanding of the world was worth anything at all. There are fans who argue that Homer's enemy is the show's thesis statement, the moment when the series articulated what it actually was rather than what it sometimes pretended to be. Not a realistic examination of working-class American life, but a fantasy, a consolation, a world where the person least equipped to manage the consequences of his own behavior never really has to, where being lovable is a more effective protection than being competent. Frank Grimes was a man who understood competence, who built his life around it, who arrived in Springfield believing that competence would be recognized and rewarded. He was wrong. Springfield doesn't reward competence. Springfield rewards belonging, and Frank could never belong, because belonging would require him to stop seeing what he saw. His grave is in the Springfield Cemetery, not far from Maud's, probably, in a town full of people who have forgotten his name, which is, of course, exactly what Frank predicted would happen. Expansion. Section 4 continued the Terwilliger family tree and its extended mysteries. Sideshow Bob's history with Bart is the trunk of his story, but the branches go in interesting directions that the show has touched on without fully exploring. Bob's education is one of these branches. He attended Yale, which he mentions with the specific casual pride of someone who attended a prestigious institution and has never found a context where that achievement was worth what he paid for it. He is, in the Simpsons universe, probably the most formally educated person in Springfield outside of Burns himself, and possibly some of the characters whose educational backgrounds are more obscure. What does it mean that this education led him here? That the product of a Yale education and a privileged upbringing and a genuine capacity for theatrical artistry ended up as second banana to a clown, and then as a convict, and then as a recurring escaped criminal whose entire life is organized around failing to kill a 10-year-old? The show treats this as darkly comic, and it is darkly comic, but it's also a genuine tragedy of misdirection, of someone whose gifts were real and whose circumstances were real, and who found the gap between them unsustainable. Bob's relationship with culture, with music and theater and literature, is one of the show's most consistent characterizations across his many appearances. He is genuinely refined in ways that Springfield doesn't have the vocabulary to appreciate. He quotes opera. He knows the standards. His theatrical sensibility is not performed affectation but genuine love. And the tragedy is that this love, this genuine aesthetic sensibility, has never found a proper home for itself. Springfield can't receive it. Prison can't receive it. Even Tuscany, where Bob seemed to find something close to a life that fit, could not contain him. Because the obsession keeps asserting itself. The vendetta keeps pulling him back. What would Bob be without the vendetta? The question is almost impossible to answer, because the vendetta has been the organizing principle of his life for so long that imagining him without it is like imagining a river without its banks. He would have to find a new shape, and nothing in his established character suggests he knows how to do that. Cecil's relationship to this question is different and interesting. Cecil also had ambitions, also had resentments, also came from the same privileged background, and arrived at a set of criminal choices. But Cecil's psychology is less purely organized around a single obsession. He is more diffuse, more practical in his villainy, capable of considering a range of potential victories where Bob can only ever see one. The sibling dynamic between them, the specific texture of what it means to be Cecil and to have Bob as your brother, to grow up in the shadow of someone whose theatrical gifts were consistently recognized as the thing that mattered in the family, is a story the show assembled the pieces for and didn't build. Cecil could have been the show's most interesting recurring antagonist after Bob himself, precisely because his relationship to Bob's story gives him a perspective that no other character has. He knows Bob from the inside. He knows the origins of the obsession or can guess at them. He has his own version of the same family history. The show used him for a single major episode and then moved him to the periphery. And somewhere in the Terwilliger family tree, beyond Cecil and Bob, there are presumably parents, a history, a household that produced two men with such dramatically maladaptive relationships to their own ambitions. The show hints at their background being patrician and theatrical, at a family that valued performance and achievement in ways that set both brothers up for specific kinds of failure. But the parents themselves are almost entirely absent from the narrative. What did the senior Terwilligers make of their sons? Did they know what Bob became? Did they understand what Cecil was doing? Is the family entirely aware, somewhere in the background of the show's continuity, of the criminal careers their sons have pursued and the very specific way those careers have been shaped by the same essential wound? The wound of feeling like your gifts were overlooked or wasted? The Terwilliger backstory is one of the richest pieces of unexplored territory in the show's supporting cast. It sits behind Bob's elaborate hairdo and his enormous shoes and his cultured voice and his persistent failure, waiting for someone to decide it matters enough to examine. The harbor is dark, and the lights of Springfield reflect in the water, wavering slightly with the movement of the surface. Somewhere out there, beyond the water, there is a life Bob could have had. He knows exactly what it looks like. He has imagined it in great detail. He just can't stop long enough to go find it. Expansion. Section 5. Continued APU's Springfield and the America he built in it. The Quickie Mart is a 24-hour operation, which means Apu's working hours have no natural boundary in the usual sense. The store is always open. There is always something that needs doing. The shelves need stocking, the machines need servicing, the hot dogs require rotation under their warming lamp. He has been doing this for decades in the show's timeline, for far longer in the show's run, and the cumulative picture that emerges across all those episodes is of a man who made a life that was not the life he planned and has found, in it, both genuine satisfaction and genuine grief. The genuine satisfaction is important to name. The show is careful, in its Better Apu episodes, not to present his life as purely a tragedy of displacement. He loves the Quickie Mart in a way that is specific and earned. He knows every regular customer. He knows what they buy and when they buy it, and the particular rhythms of their lives as they intersect with his store. He has been a witness to Springfield's daily existence in a way that few other characters have, because the Quickie Mart is the place that connects everything, the neutral ground where the different parts of the town come together around the basic business of needing things. Apu's understanding of Springfield is probably deeper than almost anyone else's, because his position means he sees people in their unguarded moments, when they're just picking up milk or lottery tickets or an impulsive candy bar, when they're not performing anything more than being a person who needs something. This is a character who could be the show's most profound observer of its own world. The man behind the counter at the Quickie Mart, taking in Springfield from the best possible vantage point, building over years and decades a complete picture of the place and its people. The show uses this potential occasionally and then sets it aside. Apu's observations about Springfield are usually played for comedy rather than for the genuine insight that his position would give him. The one person in Springfield who is not quite fully of Springfield, who retains an outsider's eye while having the insider's knowledge of long residence, is a character with an extraordinary viewpoint, and the show has never fully committed to using it. His academic background in computer science is also a thread worth following, because it suggests a person whose relationship to the modern technological world might be more sophisticated than his convenience store role implies. He studied computer science at a time when that field was at the cutting edge of human knowledge. He wrote a dissertation. He was training to work in a domain that has become, in the decades since his studies, among the most consequential in human history. What would have happened if Apu had pursued that path? Not the counterfactual version of his life, but the question of what it means that he carries this background into a job that doesn't use it. Does he still think about his field? Does he follow its developments? Is there a version of Apu who, after the Quickie Mart closes for its brief nightly window of non-operation, sits with a computer and continues some version of the intellectual work he was trained for? The show doesn't say. It rarely lets us see what Apu does when the store is not the thing in the frame, and his children. 8 of them, still there, presumably, growing as children grow even in a world where the floating timeline doesn't let them grow as visibly as they should. 8 children who were born simultaneously into a world that their father built in a country he was not originally supposed to stay in a town that he probably never expected to become permanent. What do they know about where their father came from? What do they know about the Calcutta Institute of Technology, about the dissertation, about the path that led him to Springfield? What stories does Apu tell them about the world outside this town? About the India he left, about the America he found? These are the conversations that happen in the apartment above the Quickie Mart, or in whatever domestic space the Nahasapima Pedalon family inhabits. The show has given us the exterior, the counter, the sign, the hum of the refrigerated cases. What happens behind that exterior is still largely imagined, rather than depicted. Apu is still there. The sign is still on. And the story of a man who ended up somewhere other than where he was going and built something real in the place where the plan fell apart is still not quite fully told. Expansion. Section 6. Continued the full complexity of Seymour Skinner's borrowed life. There is something about Armin Tamzarian's choice to become Seymour Skinner that the show treats as comprehensible but never treats as fully examined, and the gap between comprehensible and examined is where the most interesting questions live. He was a street punk, a kid with no prospects and no future in the conventional sense. He went to Vietnam and found something unexpected there, which was a context in which his abilities were recognizable and valuable. The military, whatever else it is, provides structure, and structure is something Tamzarian had never had. He discovered in that structure a version of himself that he didn't know existed. And then the real Skinner was captured, and the structure that had been providing Tamzarian with his first real sense of purpose suddenly needed filling, and Agnes needed a son, and Tamzarian was there. The choice he made in that moment is not difficult to understand. He was a young man who had nothing. He was being offered something. Not wealth, not power, but identity, a name, a mother, a place to return to after the war. He took it. What the show never examines is what Tamzarian did with the specific guilt of the choice. He took a dead man's identity as he believed at the time. He told a mother that her son was gone, which was true, and then let her believe he was her son, which was not. He built 30 years of life on the foundation of a deception that began with genuine grief and became, over time, something more than that. Does he dream about the real Skinner? Does he wonder, in the years before the real Skinner returns, whether Skinner survived? Does the possibility haunt him? There is an episode that suggests some version of this haunting, where Skinner's behavior in certain situations suggests that the guilt is not fully resolved, that it surfaces under pressure. But the show doesn't commit to a sustained examination of what it looks like to live a borrowed life for 30 years. To wake up every morning and be Seymour Skinner, completely, down to the relationship with Agnes and the authority over Springfield Elementary and the familiarity with the town's rhythms and people, and to know simultaneously that none of it is originally yours. The psychological literature on identity has interesting things to say about this kind of extended performance. About what happens when a person inhabits an assumed identity for long enough that the line between performance and genuine self becomes unclear. At what point does Armin Tamzarian become Seymour Skinner? At what point does the borrowed identity become the real one? Or is there always a gap, always a private place where the original person persists? The show touched this question and then backed away from it. The fanbase found the episode uncomfortable precisely because it made these questions too visible for comfortable comedy, which is exactly what the show needed to do if it was going to do the story properly. There's also the question of Agnes, who has lived 30 years believing her son returned. Who has built her relationship with Tamzarian as Skinner on the foundation of a lie she was never informed about? Who chose to believe that the man who arrived on her doorstep was her son because she needed him to be, which is something the episode depicts with surprising compassion. Agnes is not a sympathetic character in most of the show's presentations of her. She is domineering and critical and emotionally withholding in ways that have clearly damaged the man she raised. But in the context of the Tamzarian story, she is also a mother who lost a son in a war and was given a replacement and chose the replacement because the alternative was unbearable. Her choice is as comprehensible as Tamzarian's. She wanted her son back. Something was available that resembled her son. She took it. The real Skinner, the actual Seymour Skinner, was someone she mourned. When he returns, she has to process something almost impossible. Her grief was real but misplaced. Her mourning was for a man who was alive. And the man she has been calling son for 30 years is not her son at all, but someone she came to know well enough that the distinction might not feel as clear as the facts suggest it should. Her response to all of this, in the episode, is to side with the fiction. She chooses Tamzarian. She accepts the decree. She goes back to the version of her life she had before the real Skinner walked through the door. Is this heartless? Is it practical? Is it a reflection of something specific about Agnes? About her particular psychological makeup? About the way she has managed difficult truths throughout her life? The show doesn't say. It uses her choice as part of the comedic resolution and moves on. And the real Seymour Skinner is still on that train, still being carried away from the town where his identity lives, from the mother who chose the copy over the original, from the life that was taken while he was being held prisoner in a jungle thousands of miles away. His story, the real Skinner story, is the most incompletely told story in the entire series. He arrived as a disruption and left as a punchline. He deserved more than that. He deserved to be a person. Expansion. Section 7 continued what the Stonecutters revealed about Springfield's deepest structure. The song the Stonecutters sing in Homer the Great is one of the show's most catchy pieces of comedy writing, and it is also one of its most direct statements about how power actually works. The song catalogs the things the Stonecutters control, from the Academy Awards to the length of the Pope's robe. And the list is funny precisely because it mixes the genuinely significant with the deliberately trivial. They control the metric system, which is a large and consequential thing, and they also control whether Pluto is a planet, which is funny because it suggests the same organization manages both planetary classification and international standards bodies. The joke works because the list is deliberately absurd, but underneath the absurdity is a structure that the show takes seriously enough to build an episode around. The idea that the systems people live inside are controlled by people they cannot see, making decisions they will never have input into. According to rules they are not allowed to know. This is not, in American life, purely a conspiracy theory. The concentration of institutional power in small groups of connected individuals is a documented reality, not in the specific secret society form the Stonecutters take, but in the softer and more diffuse sense that the people who make consequential decisions about most Americans' lives are not elected, not accountable, and not visible in any meaningful way to the people their decisions affect. The show knew this. The Stonecutters episode is a comedy, but its comedy is built on a foundation of genuine cultural observation. The satirical content is real even if the specific form of the satire is fictional. What the show didn't do is follow the implications of the Stonecutters into the broader narrative of how Springfield actually works. If there is a secret society managing Springfield's institutional life, then every time Springfield's political process produces an outcome that seems absurd or corrupt or inexplicable, the Stonecutter framework provides an explanation. The outcomes were determined in that room. The votes, the appointments, the zoning decisions, the allocation of municipal resources, all of it was downstream of decisions made by people in purple robes who report to no one. The show uses this framework for the episode and then essentially abandons it, treating subsequent Springfield political dysfunction as the result of individual incompetence or corruption, rather than as the expression of a structural system that was revealed in Season 6 and never referenced again with consistency. There's something poignant about Homer's moment as Chosen One that the show's comedy covers over. For the first time in his life, Homer was inside the circle of power. He was, in the Stonecutters' own framework, the most important person in their organization. He had access to the levers that the show had been suggesting, in the background of every Springfield political episode, exist but are invisible to most of the town's residents. And he used this access to demand back rubs. This is funny. It is absolutely funny and entirely in character. But it is also a statement about what happens when the people who have always been outside the circle of power suddenly find themselves inside it. Homer had no framework for using power in any way beyond satisfying his immediate desires, because he had spent his entire life in a world where power was something that happened to him rather than something he exercised. When given access to it, he reverted to the only relationship to it he understood, which was the relationship of someone who wants things. The Stonecutters kicked him out and formed the No Homers Club, and the circle of power was restored to its proper configuration, and Springfield went back to being run by people with a more sophisticated relationship to what running things actually means. And Homer went back to his couch, back to his beer, back to being someone who doesn't know what makes the world work and is probably happier not knowing. The Stonecutters still meet. The No Homers Club is presumably still operational. The levers are still there, operated by the people who have always operated them. Homer is still outside the room. Expansion, Section 8. Continued Herb Powell, and the American dream he rebuilt twice. The trajectory of Herb Powell's life, taken as a complete arc, is one of the more honest things the show has done with the American success myth. He grew up with nothing. He built an empire from determination and ability. He lost the empire through trust in someone who had demonstrated, over and over, that trust in his judgment was misplaced. He rebuilt the empire from an even lower starting point, this time with the help of the least qualified possible assistant, and then he left. The leaving is the part that stays with you, if you think about it. Herb found his family. He found the biological brother he had spent his whole life not knowing he was missing. He found a sister-in-law and nieces and nephews. He experienced, probably for the first time since his adoption, what it felt like to belong to people, to be claimed, to be the missing piece of a family rather than a free-floating individual with no connective tissue to anyone. And then he took his repaired fortune and went back to wherever he came from. Why? The show doesn't say. The episode's resolution is warm, and the forgiveness is genuine, and the reunion is emotionally satisfying, and then the credits roll and Herb is gone again. One possible reading is that Herb understood something about the Simpson family that made long-term proximity inadvisable. He had already lost everything once through proximity to Homer. He loved Homer, genuinely, but he also had clear evidence of what Homer's decisions could cost. A second bankruptcy was not something he could absorb. He forgave Homer. He rebuilt. He left to protect what he'd rebuilt. This is a practical, comprehensible reason. It doesn't preclude genuine affection. It just suggests that affection and proximity are not the same thing, and that Herb Powell learned the difference, the expensive way. Another reading is that Herb, having found his family, discovered that what he had imagined family would feel like was different from what family actually felt like. He had spent his life building toward this reunion in the specific way that adopted children often do, carrying an idealized image of biological family that the reality cannot quite match. The Simpsons are lovable and chaotic and real, which means they are also exhausting and complicated and nothing like the family of his imagination. Finding them was necessary. Living with them might have been too much. And there is a third reading, which is the simplest. He found what he was looking for. He can hold it now. The need that organized his life, the need to belong to people, has been partially satisfied, and partial satisfaction is enough to change the shape of the loneliness he carries. He doesn't need to live with them to know they're there. Homer is his brother. This is a fact. It doesn't require weekly contact to remain a fact. Herb is somewhere out in the broader American landscape, building something with Powell Motors, carrying the knowledge that he has a brother, calling occasionally maybe, not calling maybe, living the life that runs parallel to the Simpson families without intersecting with it very often. The family is extended in a way that the show established and then stopped depicting. It exists. It's real. It just mostly happens off-screen, in the America that Springfield is not. Expansion. Section 9 continued the full cost of Maud Flanders' absence. The most honest thing the show ever did with Maud's death was not in the episode that depicted the death or in the immediate aftermath, but in a smaller moment that came later, when Ned is asked about her, and his response makes clear that he has not moved through the grief so much as he has built a life around it. The grief is still there. It is structural now. It is load-bearing. The faith, the goodness, the relentless kindness that defines him publicly, all of it is partly held in place by the grief, by the absence that created a gap he is perpetually trying to fill with service and decency, and the specific grace of a man who has decided to behave as though the universe is comprehensible, even when his own evidence suggests it is. This is not a criticism of Ned. It is an honest description of how grief works in a person with Ned's particular character. He cannot fall apart. He was conditioned, as the show later revealed, to prevent himself from falling apart, and the conditioning is more effective under pressure rather than less. The harder things get, the more tightly he holds himself together. What this means for Rod and Todd is something the show barely visits. Their father is a man who holds himself together by holding. They were raised in a household where the emotional vocabulary was largely confined to faith and goodness, where difficult feelings were managed through prayer and service, where the model for how to feel things was profoundly constrained. This is not abuse. It is not malicious. It is a father doing the best he knows how, which is teaching his sons the same coping mechanisms he was given, the same ways of managing what can't be spoken. But coping mechanisms are not the same as emotional processing, And children raised in households where difficult feelings are managed through performance of goodness rather than genuine acknowledgement of difficulty can sometimes arrive at adulthood with a specific kind of limitation, an ability to be good that coexists with an inability to fully feel. Is this Rod and Todd? The show gives them enough to suggest it might be. They are relentlessly good boys. They follow the rules. They are polite and considerate and well-behaved in ways that Springfield doesn't really produce. And they are also, in their most revealing moments, subtly afraid in ways that suggest the goodness is not purely natural but is at least partly a strategy, a way of being that protects them from something. From what? From their father's grief, maybe? From the thing that happened to their family that nobody fully explained? From the experience of loss that they were too young to process and are now too old to ask about directly? The show touches this and moves away from it. Rod and Todd are comedic supports in their father's stories. They are good boys. They are well-behaved. They go to church. And somewhere under the church attendance and the politeness and the relentless goodness is the grief of two children whose mother was taken from them suddenly and whose father taught them how to hold themselves together by watching him do it. Maud's grave is still in the cemetery. She is still remembered, even if the show stopped saying her name as often as it did in the first years of her absence. And her boys are still good boys. Still trying to live up to something they didn't ask to live up to. Still finding that the goodness is easier than the grief? Expansion Section 10 continued the full map of Lisa's loneliness. There is something specific about Lisa Simpson's loneliness that distinguishes it from every other kind of loneliness the show depicts, and it is important to understand it fully before we move on. Most Springfield loneliness is situational. Mo is lonely because his circumstances haven't aligned to produce a sustainable relationship. Ned is lonely because his wife died, and his conditioning prevents him from properly grieving. Barney is lonely because his alcoholism has consumed the parts of him that might have built genuine connection. These are lonely people, and their loneliness is real and the show treats it with appropriate weight, but the loneliness is the result of things that happen to them rather than of who they fundamentally are. Lisa's loneliness is different. Lisa is lonely because of what she is. Her intelligence, her principles, her emotional depth, these are not things that happen to her but things that she is, and they set her apart from her environment in ways that no change in circumstance will entirely resolve. She could stay in Springfield forever and become marginally less lonely as she found more of her people in various corners of the town's social life. But the root of her isolation, the experience of being the person in every room who thinks and feels at a different register than almost everyone around her, would persist. Because that is simply who she is. The show has given her various companions over the years who seem, briefly, to address this. Bleeding Gums offered her a model for living with her kind of feeling. Her teachers and mentors, when they actually engaged with her, offered her the experience of being met. Her relationships with Nelson and with various others offered her the experience of connection that crosses the usual barriers. But all of these companions have been temporary. The teachers moved on. Bleeding Gums died. The loves departed. The pattern of arrival and departure is so consistent that you have to ask whether it's structural, whether Lisa's particular form of brightness is something that others find themselves drawn to but unable to remain close to. This is a real phenomenon in human relationships, the kind of person whose intensity draws people in and eventually exhausts them, not through any fault of their own, but simply because maintaining closeness with someone who feels everything so completely requires a specific kind of stamina that not everyone has. Lisa is 8 years old, and she has already cycled through enough connections to establish the pattern. The show doesn't name it. It doesn't give Lisa the chance to see it herself and understand what it means for her. But the evidence is there across 36 seasons. She is also, in a way that the show is genuinely brave about acknowledging, someone whose principles create real social friction. She is not just intelligent, she is morally serious in a way that most people, including most adults, find uncomfortable. She does not let things pass. She names what she sees. She cannot pretend that something is fine when it is not fine. And in a town that has made not pretending illegal in certain contexts, this is a significant social limitation. The most honest flash-forward episode shows Lisa as a young woman who has achieved extraordinary things professionally and is deeply lonely personally. She has found her place in the world of ideas and policy. She has not found her place in the world of close human connection. The episode treats this with the seriousness it deserves, and it is, among the show's many glimpses of the future, the one that feels most accurate to who Lisa is and where her trajectory is pointing. What would change this? The show doesn't say, and maybe it genuinely doesn't know. Some things are not solvable by the end of a 22-minute episode. Some things are the ongoing work of a life, the project of finding, gradually, the people who can receive you, of learning to let yourself be received, of building tolerance for the specific vulnerability of being close to people, when closeness has always meant eventual departure. Lisa is still working on this, somewhere in the permanent present of Springfield, with her saxophone and her books, and the window that looks out on a town that mostly doesn't understand her. She is still looking for something the show has never been able to give her. She is still, despite everything, hopeful. That hope is the most honest thing about her. Expansion. Section 11 continued Burns's extended history and the mysteries of his longevity. Let's spend more time with Burns, because his story is genuinely inexhaustible, and the evening is long enough for it. His relationship to American history, the actual documented history of the 20th century as the show has placed him in it, is one of the most fascinatingly inconsistent things in the series. The floating timeline that prevents the Simpson family from aging also affects Burns, but in reverse, because Burns is explicitly ancient and the show keeps adding to his age as the real calendar advances. He was alive before the internet, before television, before most of the technologies that define the contemporary world. He was alive before the automobile was common. He has experienced, as a living participant rather than as a reader of history, the entire arc of American modernity from the Gilded Age through the present. What does this do to a mind? What does it look like to have personal memory of a world that the people around you know only from books? Burns's occasional references to his historical memories are usually played for comedy, the jarring anachronism of someone who talks about Teddy Roosevelt as a personal acquaintance, but beneath the comedy there is a genuine philosophical question. Burns is the only character in Springfield who has the perspective of deep time. He has watched not just Springfield but America change around him for more than a century. He has watched the specific American project of industrial capitalism develop from its earliest form through its contemporary expression. He was there for the initial building of the systems that contemporary America inherited. He was not just a witness but a participant, one of the people who built the structures that are now so large and old that they seem natural rather than constructed. This is an extraordinary vantage point. It is also, in Burns's case, a vantage point organized entirely around the perpetuation of the empire he serves. He has not watched American history with the detached curiosity of a historian. He has watched it as a participant in one of its most powerful interests, constantly calculating how to maintain that interest through the changes that other people experience as the normal flow of history. The show rarely gives Burns the chance to reflect on what he's seen in any sustained way. He references historical events casually, as established facts in his personal experience, but he doesn't often appear to actually think about what those facts mean. The philosophical depth that a character with his experiences might be expected to have is largely absent from his depictions, replaced by the shallower but more comedically useful characteristics of greed, contempt, and selective memory. There is a version of Burns, buried under the comedy, who is genuinely haunted by what he's seen, who has watched the world change around him and recognized, in the changes, the specific ways that his own choices have contributed to what the world became, who has lived long enough to see the consequences of decisions made generations ago begin to reveal themselves, including the consequences of his own decisions. This Burns is not the Burns who appears in the show very often, but he appears occasionally, in the quieter moments, in the scenes where something real passes across his ancient face before the contempt returns to cover it. He is the oldest person in Springfield. He is possibly the oldest person in America. And whatever he has learned from 130 years of watching and participating, he keeps to himself. Behind those ancient eyes, something enormous is stored. The show has never found a way to open it. Expansion, Section 12. Continued the full archive of Springfield's unresolved minor lives. Springfield is a town with a population that the show has built, over 36 seasons, into one of the most detailed fictional communities in any medium. And within that community, there are lives whose full stories the show has barely touched. Dr. Nick Riviera is one of these. He is Springfield's incompetent physician, the doctor you call when you cannot afford a better doctor, or when what you're asking for is something no legitimate physician would provide. His business model seems to be built on desperation and the specific willingness of desperate people to accept whatever is available rather than nothing. He is played for comedy, consistently, and the comedy works because his specific incompetence is clearly depicted. He does not know what he is doing. He is aware, on some level, that he does not know what he is doing. And he has built an entire medical practice around finding patients whose circumstances prevent them from noticing, or from having the option to notice, the gap between what they need and what they're getting. But who made him this? Where did Dr. Nick come from? The show has given him a cheerful affect that coexists, somehow, with the clear evidence that he is causing harm to his patients. The cheerfulness is not denial, exactly, but it functions as a defense against the knowledge. If he's always smiling and always greeting everyone with his signature phrase, then somehow the thing underneath the smile doesn't have to be examined. His family background, his medical education if he had one, the specific path that led him to Springfield practicing something that calls itself medicine, these are details the show has never needed to provide, because his function is clear enough without them. He's the bad doctor. That's the role. But the bad doctor has a life. He goes somewhere after the clinic closes. He presumably sleeps somewhere, eats something, has people who know him. The full person behind the white coat and the impossible cheerfulness is someone who has made a choice about how to live with what he is, and that choice is interesting in ways the show has never explored. Snake Jailbird is another figure in this category. He is Springfield's career criminal, reliable as a background presence in any episode that requires a robbery or a chase. He has a name that suggests history, that suggests an identity built around his criminal identity rather than preceding it. And the show occasionally gives him humanizing details that complicate the function. He has a girlfriend, or sometimes a wife depending on the episode. He has a dog named Santos L. Halper. He is, in his non-criminal moments, someone who seems almost entirely aware of the absurdity of his situation, who has a sense of humor about being Springfield's designated criminal that suggests he has given genuine thought to how he ended up here and decided the thinking wasn't worth more than the humor. What made Snake into Snake? The show has given him a backstory in one episode, a backstory that is deliberately absurd in the show's characteristic manner, involving a campus protest that somehow led to crime. The absurdity is funny. But the question underneath the absurdity, how does a person settle into being a criminal as an identity rather than just as a behavior, is genuinely worth sitting with. Homer's coworkers beyond Lenny and Carl are another archive of barely explored lives. There is Charlie, who works at the plant and appears in various Homer episodes as a background presence. There is Louie, who is present in enough plant scenes to suggest a consistent character, but whose actual inner life is opaque. There is Carl, Homer's secretary in one episode, who demonstrates a level of competence and grace that is almost startling in a workplace otherwise characterized by Homer's limitations, and who disappears after his episode without a forwarding address. Each of these figures exists in the permanent present of Springfield's working world, showing up for their shifts, doing their jobs, going home to lives the show has never thought it important to depict. They are the background of other people's foreground stories. But they are also people. In the full logic of the fictional world the show has built, each of them has a history and a home and a set of relationships and a private experience of the town they live in. Their perspective on Springfield is not identical to Homer's or Burns's or anyone else's. They see things that the main characters don't see, because they are positioned differently. These perspectives are the archive that 36 seasons of background world-building has assembled and never opened. The town has more in it than any amount of storytelling has managed to capture. That's both its limitation and its richness. And somewhere in the background of every episode, in the crowd scenes and the establishing shots and the walk-by moments, Springfield's uncounted residents are living their uncounted lives. They are real enough to be there. They are real enough to matter. The night is very quiet now. The background of the town has stilled. The foreground is sleeping. Let the quiet hold you for a while. We have a few more miles to walk before we're done. Expansion, Section 13. Continued Marge's art and the life she keeps almost living. Marge Simpson picks up a brush and the world changes, temporarily, and then goes back to what it was. This happens multiple times across the series. She discovers or rediscovers an artistic ability that the domestic structure of her life has kept dormant. She produces something, and the something is good, and for a few episodes or a single episode, she inhabits a version of herself that is larger than the version that keeps the house. The painting of Ringo Starr is the most famous of these moments. She submits it to a gallery. It is displayed. It attracts real attention. A celebrity sees it and responds to it genuinely. The experience of being received as an artist, of having something she made be recognized publicly, changes something in how Marge moves through her own life. And then, as with everything in Springfield, the change doesn't hold. She goes back. The painting recedes into the background. The brushes go back wherever they live in her house, in a drawer or a closet or wherever Marge puts the parts of herself that don't fit the daily routine. The question the show never fully asks is whether Marge chose this or whether it was chosen for her. Because there is a version of Marge's relationship to her artistic life in which she actively chooses not to pursue it further, not out of lack of ability but out of something more complicated. A recognition that pursuing it would require a renegotiation of her life that she is not sure she wants, or is not sure she has the right to want, or is not sure would survive contact with the reality of what professional creative work actually looks like day to day. It is easy to romanticize the artistic life from the outside. It is less easy to inhabit it, especially when you have 3 children and a husband whose reliable characteristic is needing management. The romantic version of pursuing art involves freedom and expression and the satisfying meeting of talent with purpose. The realistic version involves the specific grind of developing skill, finding an audience, navigating the economics of creative work, and maintaining the domestic life alongside it rather than instead of it. Marge might have looked at this calculation and made a realistic assessment. Not given up, exactly, but deferred. Put it in the category of things that can wait until the circumstances are more favorable. The problem with that category is that the circumstances in Springfield are never more favorable. They are always exactly what they are. And the things put in the category of waiting tend to wait forever. But there's another reading, which is more troubling and also more honest. Marge may not have chosen to defer her artistic ambitions. They may have simply been absorbed by the house and the family and the constant maintenance that her particular life requires. Not a decision, but an attrition. The creative energy was there, available, and it kept being redirected into other necessary things until the redirection became habitual and the habit became invisible. This is how many people lose their creative lives, not through dramatic abandonment, but through the gradual accumulation of other demands. Through the specific algebra of a life that doesn't have room for everything, where the things that feel least immediately urgent keep getting scheduled for later. The show has depicted this with real care in its best Marge episodes. The awareness that something valuable is being lost. The knowledge that Marge herself is partly responsible for the loss even as the conditions that produce it are genuine and demanding. The complicated guilt and grief that surrounds this kind of creative deferral. What it has not depicted is Marge making a different choice. Marge deciding that the deferred life has been deferred long enough. Marge claiming the time and the space that her creativity requires even at the cost of some disruption to the domestic order. This would require the show to imagine a Marge whose role in the family structure is not constant and unchanging. A Marge who is sometimes unavailable to hold everything together because she is doing something that requires her full attention. A Marge who occasionally lets the house be imperfect because she is painting. This is a harder Marge to write, practically, because so many plots depend on Marge as the stable center around which everything else moves. But it is also the Marge that the show has been building toward in its better moments for 36 seasons. She deserves to paint. She has always deserved to paint. The brushes are somewhere in the house. They're still there. Expansion. Section 14. Continued the full archive of Bart's unrealized becoming. Bart's various attempts at professional identity are worth tracing in detail, because the show has built up, across its long run, a surprisingly complete picture of the person he might become if the floating timeline ever allowed him to. The musician. In several episodes, Bart discovers musical ability that is both surprising and, when the show commits to it, genuinely compelling. He learns the guitar in one arc. He participates in a band in another. The musical talent is not presented as extraordinary in the way Lisa's saxophone ability is extraordinary, but it is real and it is his. It is something he found himself, rather than being assigned it by the show's characterization logic. The artist. We discussed this earlier in its own section, but it bears additional consideration here. The art episode does something specific with Bart's character that most of his storylines don't do, which is that it shows him discovering value in something slow and patient. Bart's general mode of engagement with the world is fast, reactive, explosive. Art requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to look at something for a long time, to keep looking even when the looking is difficult, to notice things that aren't obvious at first. The fact that Bart can do this, when the right conditions exist, is more than a cute revelation. It's information about who he is at a depth that his surface behavior doesn't usually reveal. Underneath the mischief is someone capable of genuine patience. Underneath the disruption is someone who, under the right circumstances, wants to make something rather than just to break something. The businessman. Bart has run multiple small enterprises over the course of the series, and his entrepreneurial instincts, while frequently channeled into projects of dubious legality or ethics, are genuine and sophisticated. He understands social dynamics. He understands leverage. He understands that information is power and that the exchange of value between people creates opportunities for someone who is paying attention. These are the skills of someone who could be genuinely effective in a wide range of professional contexts. They are also, in Springfield's economic structure, skills that get absorbed into the service of whatever scheme happens to be running, rather than into any coherent professional direction. There is a version of Bart's future that is genuinely successful, not in spite of who he is, but because of it. His ability to read social situations, his willingness to take risks, his specific kind of creativity that generates solutions to problems by routes that more cautious people wouldn't consider, these are abilities that the right context would reward rather than punish. What context is that? The show has gestured at several possible answers over the years. He could be a lawyer, exploiting his natural instinct for finding loopholes and reading situations. He could be an entertainer, channeling his performance instinct into something that doesn't get him sent to the principal's office. He could be a contractor, a builder, something physical that rewards his specific kind of problem solving. The show has let him inhabit most of these possibilities briefly and then taken them away. Because keeping any of them would require the show to commit to a development in Bart's character that the floating timeline cannot accommodate. He is still 10. The futures are all still possible. Nothing has been foreclosed. That is, depending on your perspective, either the most hopeful or the most heartbreaking thing about him. The older you get, the more you understand that the window for certain kinds of possibility has a closing time. Bart is preserved, in Springfield's eternal present, at the age before any window has closed. He has all of his futures still available to him, and he will have all of them available to him forever, because the clock never advances, and the choice never has to be made. This is the gift and the prison of Springfield, the loop that protects everything by preventing everything. Bart is 10. He is always 10. And everything he could become is still there, waiting, in the morning that the floating timeline never quite arrives at. Expansion. Section 15 continued the characters who changed Springfield and then disappeared. Leon Kompowski is a character who appears in a single episode that many consider one of the series' most unexpected and moving, and whose absence afterward is almost jarring given how much weight the show put on his presence. He claims to be Michael Jackson. He is a large man who sounds nothing like Michael Jackson, but who, in the context of the episode, claims this identity with such complete commitment that it functions as its own kind of truth. Homer meets him in a mental institution and brings him home, and the episode follows the experience of having this strange, warm, generous presence in the Simpson household. What the episode actually does, under the surface of its premise, is explore the idea that the things people present themselves as can be gifts to the people who receive those presentations, regardless of their literal truth. The man who claims to be Michael Jackson helps Bart repair a relationship with Lisa through a song written specifically for her. The act is genuine even if the identity is false. And then he leaves. He walks out the door, drops the Michael Jackson persona with a smile, and continues his journey. He gives The Simpsons something real and takes nothing but his own strangeness with him. This character was played by Michael Jackson himself, uncredited, and the episode was held back from syndication for years because of that connection. But the character as a character, independent of the circumstances of his creation, is one of the show's most interesting brief presences. What would his life look like? The man who sometimes claims to be Michael Jackson, who moves through the world offering gifts and moving on. The show gives him one episode and lets him go. He is, perhaps, better for his singularity. He could only be what he was in that episode and then not that anymore. But the Simon family's experience of him, what they carried forward from that encounter, what it changed or didn't change, is another thread the show opened and let drop. Cooter and Spud, the traveling musicians from one of the show's most beloved episodes, offer another version of this. Two street performers who arrive in Springfield and immediately find common ground with Lisa, who recognizes in their music the same love she has for her own instrument. The episode is about what it means to encounter people who live according to their art, rather than compromising it for practicality. And what that encounter does to someone like Lisa, who is always being told to be more practical. They leave Springfield and take their music with them. Lisa is left with what they gave her, which is confirmation that the way she loves music is real and worth sustaining, but she doesn't have them. She doesn't have ongoing access to the community they represented. She has the memory of it and the determination to find her way back to it eventually. Every character who arrives in Springfield and leaves takes something with them that Springfield can't quite provide for itself. The outsiders, the ones who come through briefly and change something by their passage, are some of the show's most important characters and some of its most underexamined ones. Because the show lives in Springfield, it comes home every episode. The people who pass through are figures on the road, visible and then gone, important and then absent. And the residents of Springfield stand at their windows and watch them go, and go back to being who they are, in the town that is always the same. Expansion, Section 16, continued the ending that lives in the gaps. We've been walking through Springfield for a long time now. Hours. The town has shifted around us in the way a place shifts at night, becoming more itself, quieter and stranger, the surfaces visible without the movement of the day to distract from them. Let's sit for a moment with the full weight of what we've been cataloging. Not the individual threads, but the shape of all of them together. Every unresolved storyline we've discussed has something in common. They were all started with genuine intention. The writers who introduced Nelson's situation, who brought Ling to Springfield, who created Frank Grimes, who gave Bob a wife and child, who let Marge paint, who showed Barney sober, they were doing something real. They were adding to the show's world with full understanding that what they were adding mattered. The resolution, or lack of it, was not always a choice. Sometimes it was circumstance. The actress who voiced Edna died and the storyline died with her. Sometimes it was the practical limitations of episodic television, which rewards setup but struggles to maintain sustained payoff over multiple seasons. Sometimes it was a deliberate retreat from material that was proving more complicated than the show had room for. But in the aggregate, what the unresolved storylines create is something remarkable. They create the impression of a world that is genuinely larger than the frame. A world where things keep happening even when the camera is not pointing at them, where people keep living their lives in the gaps between episodes, accumulating experience and history and change even when the show is elsewhere. This impression is actually the most honest thing about Springfield. Life is like this. It doesn't resolve neatly at the end of 22 minutes. It doesn't provide satisfying conclusions to every thread it opens. It creates characters and situations and relationships and then moves on. And the characters keep existing in the background of your life without your full attention, living their stories in the space you're not watching. The show, in its unresolved storylines, is being more realistic than it gets credit for. The incompleteness is not a failure. It is a true depiction of how life actually operates. What was Nelson's life really like after the show stopped looking? It continued. He made it through elementary school, presumably. He had experiences the show didn't show us. He encountered things that shaped him in ways we can't see. He became someone, is becoming someone, in the permanent present of Springfield. We just can't see it. The camera is somewhere else. This is the condition of caring about people. The people you care about keep living whether or not you're watching. They have their full lives, complete with consequences and revelations and reversals and moments of genuine grace, and most of it happens without a witness. Springfield is, in this sense, the truest portrait of American community the medium has ever produced. Not because it gets everything right, but because it has been running long enough that its incompleteness has started to resemble the actual texture of belonging somewhere, of knowing people over decades, of watching a place change and stay the same and change again. The unresolved storylines are the noise of a world that exists beyond the frame. They are the lives that go on when the episode ends. They are the evidence that Springfield is more than a backdrop, more than a setting, more than the stage for the Simpsons' weekly adventures. It is a real place as a fictional place can be. And the people in it are real enough to have histories that don't fit in a single episode, feelings that don't resolve in a single story, lives that continue past the credits. We've been with them all night. We know them better than we did when we started. And the knowing is enough, even without the resolution. Maybe especially without the resolution, because the resolution would mean the ending, and the ending would mean leaving. And we're not quite ready to leave yet. Additional section: Otto and the Road Not Taken. There is a school bus driver in Springfield who has the soul of a rock musician and the circumstances of someone for whom rock musicianship never quite became a life, rather than an aspiration. Otto Mann drives the bus. He has been driving the bus since the show began. He will be driving the bus long after most of its viewers have forgotten every other detail they once knew about Springfield. He is reliable in his unreliability, present in his absence, consistently and cheerfully disconnected from any version of conventional adult responsibility. The comedy around Otto is easy and reliable. He's stoned, he's oblivious, he plays his music at inappropriate volumes. He takes curves in the bus at speeds that should be illegal, which they might be, he hasn't checked. The kids are mostly fine, probably, but Otto has a history. The show has given him fragments of it. He has been in bands. He was once genuinely pursuing the dream of professional musicianship, moving through the world with his guitar and his particular outlook, and a genuine belief that talent and passion would eventually add up to something career-shaped. They didn't. Or they did, briefly, and then circumstances changed, and the band ended or dispersed or failed to find its audience, or simply ran out of the specific energy that sustains a group of people in the difficult years between aspiration and arrival. And Otto ended up in Springfield driving a bus. The show treats this as his natural state. He seems happy, in his particular detached way. He does not seem to be suffering the loss of his musical ambitions. He plays his music on his own terms, without an audience, without a career, without the specific pressure of professional expectation, and this seems to be fine with him. But there is a quieter reading in which Otto's contentment is the contentment of someone who has made a particular piece, who had a dream, pursued it, watched it fail to materialize, and made a decision at some point to stop pursuing and start living with what the pursuit had left him. He still has the music. He still has the guitar. He still has the knowledge of who he is when the music is playing. What he doesn't have is the audience he imagined, the career he envisioned, the specific version of his life that the dream promised. And he has decided, in the way that some people are able to decide and others never quite manage, that this is all right, that the music is enough, with or without the career, that the dream was the direction and the living was the destination, and he has arrived somewhere he can be in. This is, actually, a kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of resignation, but the wisdom of honest accounting, of knowing what you have and deciding it is sufficient. The show treats Otto's contentment as a joke, as the obliviousness of someone too stoned to notice what he's missing. But there is another reading available. Otto might be one of the most genuinely at peace people in Springfield, not because he stopped caring about things, but because he found a way to care about them that didn't require the world to give him what he'd asked for. His bus is still running. The kids still get to school. The music is still playing somewhere, on headphones or through the bus's speakers at unsafe volumes, or on his guitar in whatever apartment he returns to at the end of his routes. Otto still has the music. That's not nothing. That might actually be everything. Additional section: Edna Krabappel's last years and what they meant. Before she died, in the real world's time, Edna Krabappel was building towards something. Her relationship with Ned Flanders was, in its best moments, genuinely surprising and genuinely warm. Two people who existed at opposite ends of Springfield's social and spiritual spectrum, who had no obvious reason to find each other, discovering that they were meeting each other in some important way. Ned's faith and Edna's cynicism didn't cancel each other out. They created a tension that was productive, that kept both of them more alive and more present than their established patterns would have allowed. Edna was changed by this relationship in ways the show depicted with real care. She was a woman who had spent her professional life being depleted by work that no longer gave her what she'd hoped it would, who had organized her personal life around a series of relationships that hadn't lasted, who had settled into a worldview in which expectation was something to be managed down rather than expanded. Ned, in his specific way, disrupted this. He was someone who expected good things with a consistency that bordered on the naive, and his expectations kept being violated by a world that was less good than he believed it to be, and yet he kept expecting. There was something in his persistence that reached Edna in a way that more sophisticated persuasions hadn't. She started to hope again. Not obviously, not in ways she would have named directly, but the evidence was there in how she engaged with the relationship, in the care she brought to it, in the willingness to be vulnerable that her character had always protected against. And then, in the real world, Marcia Wallace died. And with her died Edna. And with Edna died the hope she had been building toward. The show honored this loss with a grace that made clear how much Edna had mattered, not just as a comedic resource, but as a genuine character with a genuine interior life. The episode that marked her departure was quiet and sad and earned, but the storyline was incomplete. What Edna and Ned were building together, the specific thing their unlikely pairing was becoming, was cut short by circumstances rather than by narrative choice. Ned has been alone since. The show has moved past it. His life continues without the person who was beginning to make it look different. And Edna, somewhere in the permanent present of Springfield's eternity, is still in her classroom. Is still there, in the continuity the show maintains even when it doesn't visit. She is part of Springfield in the way that the dead become part of the places that knew them, present in absence, real in memory. She was more than her function. She was always more than her function. That's the most important thing to remember about her. Final additional section. The Simpsons themselves, and the question they've been asking for 36 years. What is a family for? This is the question that sits at the center of every episode, every unresolved storyline, every thread that got pulled and left dangling, every character who arrived and departed, and was loved and forgotten and remembered again. What is a family for? The Simpsons is a show that has been asking this question for 36 years, and it has never stopped finding new angles on it, new ways to approach the question from different directions, new evidence to weigh on both sides. A family is for protection. Homer and Marge have protected their children from more than any real family is likely to face, nuclear threats and criminal masterminds, and the specific dangers that accumulate when you live in Springfield. The protection is real even when it's clumsy, and even when Homer is the primary source of the danger being managed. A family is for witness. The Simpson family witnesses each other. They see each other in ways that the broader world does not. Marge sees Homer's goodness through his failures. Homer sees Marge's hidden life, imperfectly, but with a genuine desire to see it. Lisa and Bart see each other with the specific clarity of siblings, knowing each other in the way that only proximity produces. Maggie sees everything, silently, from her privileged position as the one everyone overlooks. A family is for continuity. The children carry forward what the parents build, even when what they build is imperfect, even when the carrying is itself a form of struggle. Homer carries the damage that Burns and Springfield created in his parents' generation. Bart and Lisa and Maggie will carry what Homer and Marge built, the good and the complicated both. A family is for belonging, for the specific experience of being in a room with people who have no choice but to receive you, who cannot simply stop knowing you, who are tangled into your life in ways that nothing short of catastrophe can undo. This is the gift and the burden. Springfield, for all its disasters, has not undone the family at 742 Evergreen Terrace, and a family is, perhaps most importantly, for the work of ongoing love. Not the love that arrives complete and requires no maintenance, but the love that has to be practiced, that requires decisions and effort and recommitment, that faces the specific challenge of becoming familiar enough to take for granted while remaining deliberately not taken for granted. Homer and Marge do this. Imperfectly, often incoherently, with frequent catastrophic failures and surprising moments of grace. But they do it. Every episode at some level is about the ongoing work of their love and the ongoing work of what they're making with their children. The unresolved storylines are the texture of this work. The loose threads are the actual fabric of a life. The things left unfinished are not failures. They are evidence that something is genuinely being attempted, that the attempt is ongoing, that the story has not finished because the people in it have not finished. This is the most honest thing The Simpsons has ever been, and it has been honest about it for 36 years. The family is still there. The house is still standing. The work is still being done. And all the characters we visited tonight, all the threads we followed into their various incompletions, they are all evidence of the same thing, a world that is more than its own completeness. A town where things begin and don't quite end, where people arrive and don't quite leave, where the future is always being begun and the past is never quite resolved. This is Springfield. This is home. Let the town settle around you now. Let the stories drift through the dark the way they do when you're almost asleep. Present without demanding anything, there without requiring you to do anything about them. The plant is humming. The sign is on. The couch at 742 is empty right now because everyone is in bed, which is exactly where they should be. And somewhere in the deep quiet of the Springfield night, all the unresolved stories are continuing, as they always have, as they always will. They will still be there tomorrow. So will you. So will the whole beautiful, broken, improbable, beloved town. Sleep well. Good night. End. Additional section. Springfield's geography and the lives shaped by where they live. Let's stay a while longer with the physical town, because Springfield's geography, its specific landscape, shapes its characters in ways that the show has built carefully, without always acknowledging. The nuclear plant defines the skyline. 2 cooling towers, always visible from almost anywhere in town, a constant reminder of the power source that keeps the lights on and, if the theories are correct, poisons everything beneath them. Most residents of Springfield have spent so long with those towers on their horizon that they no longer see them. They have become part of the visual vocabulary of home, neutral as the hills, familiar as the sky. This is how proximity works. You stop seeing what you stop being surprised by. The quick E-Mart is the town's hub in a different sense. Where the plant towers over Springfield from a distance, the quick E-Mart is in the middle of everything, accessible, central, the place where the town's daily life flows through. It is the connective tissue of Springfield's social geography, the place where people from different parts of the town's social and economic spectrum end up standing next to each other briefly in the basic business of needing things. Moe's Tavern is a different kind of center. It is the emotional center of a certain subset of Springfield's male population, the place where the specific disappointments and satisfactions of working-class Springfield get processed, verbally and through the medium of beer. The tavern has its own ecology, its own social rules, its own hierarchy. Barney is at one end of the hierarchy and Homer is at the other, in the sense that Homer's relationship to the bar is different from the relationships of the people who live there, spiritually if not physically. Homer goes to Moe's. He doesn't live there the way Barney and certain others seem to. He is a visitor, a welcome visitor, deeply embedded in the tavern's social life, but ultimately someone who goes home at the end of the evening to a house and a family. This distinction matters more than the show usually examines. Homer's ability to go home is the thing that separates him from the tavern's permanent residents, and the permanent residents know this even if the show doesn't make much of it. Springfield Elementary sits in the middle of the town, accessible to most of the neighborhoods that feed into it, and its physical state reflects the institutional history we discussed earlier. The building is old. The equipment is outdated. The infrastructure has been neglected for the decades since Burns stole the oil wells' revenue. The physical environment that Springfield's children learn in is, by any reasonable standard, substandard. And the children adapt to it. They always adapt to it. Children are extraordinary in their capacity to normalize whatever environment they're given. They do not know, in any experiential sense, what a better resourced school looks like from the inside. Springfield Elementary is the school. Its limitations are, to them, the normal baseline. This is a political statement, available in the show's architecture to anyone who wants to look for it. The inadequacy of the school is invisible to the people most affected by it because they lack the context to see it as inadequacy rather than as just how things are. The town hall, which is the site of Springfield's democratic processes, is another space where the show has built in more than it typically examines. The meetings that take place there, the votes that are cast, The decisions that are made in the ostensible name of the community's collective will are all presented as available to the show's comedic needs. They are the site of mob behavior, of Springfield's particular brand of collective irrationality, of the town's tendency to form opinions quickly and hold them violently until the next opinion comes along. But the town hall is also the place where Springfield's genuine political life happens, where the people who actually care about the community's direction try to make that direction happen through the available mechanisms. Mayor Quimby is corrupt. Chief Wiggum is incompetent. The town's official governance is not a model of effective democratic function, but the show's residents keep showing up to the meetings. They keep voting. They keep exercising, however imperfectly, their membership in this community. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, one of the show's most quietly hopeful characteristics. Despite everything, despite the corruption and the incompetence and the collective amnesia and the ongoing environmental poisoning, the residents of Springfield keep participating. They keep showing up to hold their representatives accountable, even if the accountability is imperfect and the representatives are unimpressive. There is something in this that the show rarely names but consistently depicts. A community that, for all its failures, maintains some investment in its own governance. A town that believes at some level that what happens here can be influenced by the people who live here. This belief is not always justified. It is regularly exploited and disappointed, but it persists. It persists in Homer, who complains about the town's management but keeps involving himself with it. It persists in Lisa, who challenges Springfield's institutions while remaining committed to the idea that institutions can be improved. It persists in Marge, who attends community meetings and writes letters and does the slow, unglamorous work of citizenship. Springfield is not a good town, by most measures, but it is a town that keeps trying to be one. The geography holds this trying in place. The streets connect people who would otherwise not encounter each other. The shared spaces create the conditions for the shared life, however imperfect that life is. The cooling towers cast their shadow over everything, and the shadow is real, and the damage it implies is real, and underneath the shadow, the town continues. Streets that have been walked by the same feet for 36 years without aging. Houses that have been lived in by the same families through the same seasonal cycles. The same sky above everything, wide and mostly indifferent, occasionally spectacular in the way that Springfield's sky gets spectacular for comedic purposes or for genuine visual beauty. This is the town. It is ours, in the specific way that fictional places become ours through long acquaintance, through the slow accumulation of knowledge and feeling that 36 years of watching produces. We know it. We know its streets and its buildings and its smells and its particular quality of light in the afternoon. We know who lives where and what they care about and how they fail and how they recover. We love it, even. In the complicated way you love a place that is both comfort and frustration, both home and limitation. Springfield. Still there. Still ours. Additional section. The music of Springfield and what it tells us about the unfinished stories. The show has always understood music. Not just as a plot device, not just as a source of memorable comedic songs, but as a genuine emotional language that its characters speak at different levels of fluency. Lisa speaks it fluently. Bleeding Gums Murphy was native to it. Bart has access to it in ways he doesn't always use. Homer has a relationship to music that is simpler and more direct than anyone else's, organized around the specific pleasure of a song that hits him somewhere undefended. The musical moments in the show are consistently its most emotionally naked moments. When the show reaches for music, it is usually reaching for something that it cannot say directly, something that requires the particular access that music has to feeling. Homer's singing, which happens in scattered episodes with a warmth that surprises you every time, suggests a person whose relationship to his own feeling is most open when the feeling comes through sound rather than words. He is not always articulate. He is often inarticulate in the specific way of someone whose emotional life is rich, but whose vocabulary for it is limited. But when he sings, something that is usually inaccessible becomes available. Bart's relationship to music is expressed most clearly in the moments where he stumbles into it unexpectedly, where the music finds him rather than the other way around. He is a passive recipient more often than an active seeker, but the reception, when it happens, is real. He has been moved by music in ways that the show depicts honestly, not as comic revelation, but as genuine experience. Lisa is the character whose musical life is most fully explored, and we have discussed it in its romantic context, but the music itself deserves acknowledgement separate from the relationships it surrounds. She plays the saxophone with a feeling that exceeds her age, and the show has always treated this with the respect it deserves, rather than as a precocious party trick. The feeling in her playing is real. It is the overflow of everything she feels and cannot otherwise express. The grief and the longing and the specific joy of being completely herself for the duration of a song. The school band, the various musical formations that move through Springfield's community life, Krusty's entertainment industry with its musicians and performers, the bar's jukebox, the music that plays at Springfield's various events and celebrations, all of it adds up to a musical world that is richer than the show usually makes explicit. And the characters whose musical lives were introduced and then abandoned are part of the unresolved landscape we've been walking through tonight. Bleeding Gums left an absence that the show has never filled, not because it didn't try, but because what he represented to Lisa, the possibility of a life organized around music and feeling, rather than around practicality, is not something that the show could sustain without him as a living example. The music plays on. It always plays on. Somewhere in Springfield's various spaces, at any given moment, something is playing. Someone is listening. Someone is being moved. The music is the most honest part of the show's emotional life, the part that bypasses the comedy and the irony and the protective distance and says directly what the characters cannot otherwise say. And all the storylines that ended without resolution, all the threads that got dropped, all the lives that continued out of frame, they are present in the music. In the jazz that Bleeding Gums left in the air of Springfield after he was gone, in the guitar riffs that Otto plays to himself on long afternoons, in Lisa's saxophone at her window, the music carries the unresolved things the way music always carries what language cannot hold. It's playing right now, somewhere in Springfield. You can hear it if you let yourself. Additional section: Homer's dreams and the unconscious life of Springfield. In the long quiet of the Springfield night, when the town is as still as it gets, Homer dreams. We've discussed the coma theory at length in other contexts, and we're not going to revisit its full scope here. But there's something worth sitting with specifically about Homer's dreams as they appear in the show, as opposed to Homer's entire existence as potentially a dream. The show has spent considerable time inside Homer's imagination and unconscious, in episodes that explore his fantasy life, his fears, his buried wishes. What emerges from all of this, when you look at it as a whole, is a picture of an inner life that is considerably richer than Homer's external behavior suggests. His fantasies are vivid and specific. He imagines being celebrated in ways that map perfectly onto his deepest insecurities. He imagines worlds in which he is competent and impressive and memorable, which are the precise qualities that his waking life consistently denies him. His dreams are not random. They are the photographic negative of his anxieties, and his fears, when they emerge in the show's more serious explorations, are organized around the same core as everything else in his character: losing his family, being left, being forgotten by the people whose remembering matters most to him. Not Burns's memory, though Burns's failure to remember him is a genuine source of pain. Marge's memory, his children's memory, the specific terror of becoming invisible to the people who are supposed to see you. These fears are connected to Mona's departure, to the specific wound that was created when Homer woke up one morning and his mother was gone. The unconscious logic is simple and devastating. If his mother could leave without warning, anyone could. The love he feels toward Marge, the way he holds onto his family with a combination of genuine warmth and subtle desperation, the need to be remembered, to be known, to be the person whose name is said by the people he loves, all of it traces back to that morning when a 6-year-old woke up and found his world already different. The unresolved storyline of Homer's psychology is, in a sense, the most significant unresolved storyline in the show, because it is the engine that drives everything else. His incompetence, his neediness, his indestructibility, his capacity for unexpected grace, all of it is downstream of the specific damage he carries and the specific compensation he has built around it. The reckoning with this damage, the moment when Homer would need to look at what happened to him and understand it clearly, has never come. The show has given him glimpses of understanding, moments where the full truth of his history is visible to him, but has never committed to the sustained, honest accounting that would actually change the pattern rather than just briefly illuminating it. This is the show being protective of its own engine. A Homer who has genuinely processed his trauma is a different Homer, with different drives, and different drives would produce different stories. The show needs Homer to be who he is. So, Homer remains partly unresolved, partly still reaching backward through his life for something that was taken, still operating from the wound even in the moments when he is most fully himself. His dreams continue. Whatever they are, they continue. Whatever they carry it faithfully. And when he wakes up, he will be in his house, on Evergreen Terrace, with his family around him. That is enough. For Homer, it has always been enough. The dream, if it is a dream, continues. The family is still there. The loop keeps turning, and Homer keeps waking up to them, morning after morning, in the eternal present of a town that will not let time pass. He is still the luckiest, unlucky man in the history of animation. He is still loved beyond what his behavior deserves. He is still, inexplicably, home. And that's the whole point, really. That's the whole thing. Final close. The night is ending, or it is fully dark, depending on when you arrived here and where you are. We have spent these hours together in Springfield, walking through its streets and its buildings and its decades of unfinished business. We have visited the people who deserved more than they got from the story. We have followed the threads that got dropped, and the doors that got opened, and the mornings that never quite arrived. And what we have found, in all of this, is not absence, not failure, not the negligence of writers who didn't care enough to finish what they started. What we have found is a world that is real enough to outgrow its frame. Springfield is too big for any amount of storytelling to complete. The people in it are too complicated for any episode to fully know. The stories that were started and not finished are not the story's failures. They are its proof of life. Evidence that something is actually there, behind the jokes and the animation and the 36 years of Sunday nights. Something that feels real. Something that feels like home. The cooling towers are still against the sky, lit from beneath, those two pale columns of vapor rising into the dark. From here they look almost peaceful. From here, everything looks almost peaceful. The plant is still humming. The sign is still on. The couch at 742 is still the couch, and the family is still the family. You are still here. You stayed for all of it, or most of it, or you fell asleep somewhere in the middle and the stories kept going anyway, moving through the dark the way stories do when they have somewhere to be. Springfield will be there tomorrow. It will always be there tomorrow. And the stories we didn't get to finish, the ones the show started and the ones we started together tonight, they will still be waiting. Patient as they always have been. Real as they always have been. Good night to all of it. Good night to Nelson Muntz and Frank Grimes and Herb Powell and Ling Bouvier and Barney Gumble and Otto and Edna and all the others. Good night to the plant and the Quick E-Mart and Moe's and the school and the town hall. Good night to the Simpsons, still together, still on their couch, still in their loop. Good night to Springfield. Good night.